The cliffs did not look climbable, and that was the point. Rising sheer from the English Channel, battered by wind and tide, Pointe du Hoc was a wall of stone meant to stop an invasion before it ever reached the beach. From above, German guns were believed to command both Omaha and Utah beaches, capable of tearing landing craft apart before men could even step ashore. From below, the cliffs looked like a death sentence. And yet, on the morning of D-Day, men were sent straight toward them, not to flank them, not to bypass them, but to climb them, under fire. Pointe du Hoc was never meant to be held for long. It was meant to be neutralized quickly, violently, and at enormous risk. If the guns were left intact, thousands of soldiers landing nearby could be cut down within minutes. If the assault failed, there would be no second attempt. The mission fell to the U.S. Army Rangers. They trained for this moment knowing there was no safe version of the task. Rope ladders, scaling hooks, rockets fired into stone, every detail assumed resistance, confusion, and loss. The plan accepted casualties as inevitable, because hesitation would be worse. When the assault began, almost nothing went according to plan. Landing craft were scattered by rough seas. Units arrived late and out of position. Smoke obscured landmarks. As Rangers approached the cliffs, German fire raked the water. Bullets struck boats. Shrapnel tore through equipment. Men were hit before they ever touched land. The cliffs loomed higher with every second. And still, the climb began. Ropes went up, slick with seawater. Hands searched for purchase in crumbling rock. Explosions showered debris downward. Some ladders were cut, some ropes failed. Men fell back into the surf. Others kept climbing, not because it was possible, but because stopping meant certain death. When the Rangers reached the top, they found something unexpected. The guns were not there. They had been moved inland, hidden, repositioned, and left behind dummy emplacements to deceive reconnaissance. The mission did not end with the climb. It expanded instantly. Small Ranger teams pushed inland through hedgerows and fields, hunting artillery pieces with limited ammunition, no armor, and no clear sense of enemy strength. Patrols moved cautiously, knowing they were isolated and surrounded. When the guns were finally found, they were destroyed with whatever explosives could be carried. The immediate threat to the beaches was removed, quietly, without spectacle, even as the men who accomplished it fought on without reinforcement. Holding Pointe du Hoc was just as brutal as taking it. German counterattacks came quickly. Supplies ran low. Casualties mounted. For 2 days, the Rangers held against repeated assaults, cut off from the main landings, uncertain whether anyone knew they were still alive. Positions changed hands. Bunkers became shelters. Craters became foxholes. By the time relief arrived, the cost was staggering. Of the men who had landed beneath the cliffs, barely half remained combat effective. The ground they held was scarred beyond recognition, torn open by shell fire and soaked with exhaustion. Pointe du Hoc mattered not because it was large, but because it was decisive. It removed a threat before it could act. It protected landings that would define the invasion. It showed what modern warfare demanded of small units placed in impossible situations. The story of Pointe du Hoc is not about flawless execution. It is about commitment in the absence of certainty, about men climbing knowing the odds, about missions where success is measured not by survival, but by necessity. Tonight, we return to those cliffs, to the ropes cutting into stone, to the men climbing into gunfire, to the place where D-Day was decided quietly, vertically, and at a terrible cost. And before we continue, if you're still here, listening all the way through, if these long, immersive journeys into history help you slow down, focus, or reflect at the end of the day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel. You're helping keep this calm, in-depth style of storytelling alive. If this space gives you perspective, grounding, or simply somewhere steady to sit with history, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the history of Pointe du Hoc. January 17th, 1944. Flight Lieutenant Peter Mallory banks his Supermarine Spitfire into a steep dive over the Norman coast. The channel winds battering his wings as German flak bursts pepper the sky around him. Below, jutting into the gray Atlantic like a stone dagger, lies a promontory the locals call Pointe du Hoc. Through his gun camera lens, Mallory captures what Allied intelligence has feared for months. 6 massive concrete emplacements, each one housing artillery pieces capable of turning the upcoming invasion into a massacre. He doesn't know it yet, but the photographs he's risking his life to take will condemn 225 American soldiers to one of the most desperate missions in military history. The fortress he's photographing isn't supposed to exist this far along the coast, but there it sits, impossibly perched atop sheer limestone cliffs that rise 100 feet straight from the sea. 300 miles away in London, the photographs land on the desk of Lieutenant Colonel James Hill with the weight of a death sentence. The intelligence room at Norfolk House smells of cigarette smoke and coffee gone cold, where a dozen officers huddle around reconnaissance images spread across mahogany tables like cards in a high-stakes poker game. Hill uses a ruler to measure the distance from the clifftop guns to the planned landing zones. And the mathematics are brutally simple. Each of those 6 French GPF 155mm guns can hurl a 95-pound shell more than 25,000 yards, which means they command every inch of both Utah and Omaha beaches. A single gun crew, properly trained and supplied, can fire 4 rounds per minute, turning landing craft into floating coffins before the first soldier sets foot on French soil. Hill sets down his ruler and reaches for another cigarette, knowing that someone, somewhere, will have to climb those cliffs and silence those guns, or Operation Overlord will drown in blood before it begins. The fortress growing atop Pointe du Hoc represents 18 months of German engineering, genius, and French forced labor. Beginning in early 1942, organization taught workers poured thousands of tons of concrete into forms designed to withstand 500-kilogram bombs, creating casemates with walls 6 feet thick and reinforced steel doors. The guns themselves are prizes of war, captured French artillery pieces that the Germans have turned against their former owners with typical Wehrmacht efficiency. Each emplacement is positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and between them lies a deadly maze of machine gun nests, mortar pits, and communication trenches connecting everything into a unified killing system. By the winter of 1944, Widerstands Nest 75, as the Germans designate it, has become one of the crown jewels of the Atlantic Wall, a fortress that German commanders believe cannot be taken by frontal assault. The location itself seems chosen by the gods of war. Pointe du Hoc sits roughly 43 kilometers west of what will become Omaha Beach, perfectly positioned between the 2 American landing zones like a watchtower guarding a castle gate. The cliffs rise 30 meters straight from the rocky shore, composed of limestone that flakes and crumbles under pressure, offering no natural handholds for climbers. German defenders have strengthened nature's defenses with coils of barbed wire along the clifftop, minefields in the approaches, and pre-registered mortar coordinates covering every conceivable landing spot. The nearest road, Route National 13, runs directly behind the position, allowing rapid reinforcement from reserve units stationed inland. On paper, in briefing rooms, in the nightmares of Allied planners, Pointe du Hoc represents an impossible problem, wrapped in a strategic necessity. The men assigned to hold this fortress are not elite troops, but they don't need to be. The 2nd Battalion of the 916th Grenadier Regiment, part of the 352nd Infantry Division, includes a mix of veterans rotated back from the Eastern Front and young conscripts experiencing their first posting. Their commander, Oberleutnant Freiherr von Schoeneich, is an aristocratic officer who survived the hell of Stalingrad and considers the Atlantic Wall a vacation posting. He has approximately 200 men under his command, which sounds modest until you consider that they occupy fortified positions and enjoy every advantage of terrain and preparation. These men eat hot meals, sleep in bunkers proof against all but direct hits from battleship guns, and spend their days drilling on weapons that can reach targets miles away. They have been told, repeatedly, that the cliffs make their position impregnable, that no assault force could possibly scale those walls under fire. Allied intelligence officers know better than to trust German confidence, but the reconnaissance photographs tell a story that's hard to dispute. By March 1944, the RAF has flown more than 60 missions over Pointe du Hoc. each sortie adding to a thick folder of images that show the position growing stronger by the week. Photo analysts using stereoscopic viewers can count the individual sandbags protecting machine gun positions, can measure the thickness of concrete pours, can track the routine movements of German personnel as they go about their daily business of preparing to kill Allied soldiers. What the photographs cannot show is intention or readiness, or the state of training among the defenders. They show a fortress, but they cannot reveal whether it's manned by fanatics or by tired men who just want the war to end. This uncertainty will haunt every decision made about how to neutralize the guns. The strategic calculation facing Allied commanders is stark and unforgiving. Operation Overlord depends absolutely on getting troops ashore and inland before German armored divisions can respond in force. Utah Beach, the westernmost American landing zone, is tasked with linking up with airborne forces dropped inland and pushing west to seal off the Cotentin Peninsula, cutting off the port of Cherbourg. If the guns at Pointe du Hoc remain operational on D-Day, they can interdict that entire operation, destroying landing craft in the water and pinning down troops on the beach until German reinforcements arrive. The mathematics are simple. 6 guns, with crews capable of sustained fire, could deliver thousands of rounds onto concentrated landing zones, where men and vehicles have nowhere to hide. Every military staff college teaches that artillery is the king of battle, and these particular guns wear a crown forged from perfect positioning and devastating range. But there's another calculation, quieter and more terrible, taking place in the minds of the generals planning this invasion. Even if the guns at Pointe du Hoc are destroyed, even if they're silenced before they fire a shot, the cost of taking that position might be catastrophic. British commandos, veterans of raids on Dieppe and Norway, have been consulted about the feasibility of a cliff assault, and their answers range from pessimistic to dismissive. The cliffs are too high, the defenders too well positioned, the entire concept too dependent on equipment that hasn't been tested in combat conditions. One British colonel, after reviewing the proposed assault plan, simply writes in his report, "This is not a military operation. It's a suicide mission with delusions of tactical value." That report will be filed away, but it captures a truth that everyone involved understands perfectly well. Someone is going to have to climb those cliffs, and not all of them are coming back. By late March, the reconnaissance photographs show something new and deeply troubling. Allied bombers, attempting to soften up the position in advance of the invasion, have dropped 698 tons of high explosive on Pointe du Hoc, turning the clifftop into a moonscape of overlapping craters. The bombardment represents one of the most concentrated pre-invasion strikes in the entire Overlord plan. A deliberate attempt to bury the guns under thousands of tons of earth and shattered concrete. But photo analysts examining the post-strike imagery notice disturbing signs. Camouflage netting that appears to have been repositioned, earth that looks freshly disturbed in patterns suggesting equipment has been moved. What might be wooden decoys positioned where real guns once stood. The images raise more questions than they answer. Have the guns been destroyed or merely relocated? Are the Germans aware that Pointe du Hoc has drawn such intensive attention? And if the guns aren't there anymore, is an assault even necessary? On a rainy afternoon in April, a final reconnaissance mission brings back photographs that will shape the invasion plan in its last crucial weeks. The images show Pointe du Hoc from multiple angles, using oblique photography to reveal details that vertical shots miss. What they reveal is both reassuring and terrifying. The fortifications remain largely intact despite the bombing, which means the position is still dangerous, but also means there are structures that assault troops might use for cover. The gun emplacements appear to be casemates now, enclosed concrete structures rather than open pits, which could mean the guns are still operational, or could mean the Germans are building decoys to draw fire away from real artillery positions elsewhere. As these final photographs circulate through Allied headquarters, one thing becomes absolutely clear. Whether the guns are there or not, whether they are functional or destroyed, Pointe du Hoc cannot be ignored. Someone will have to climb those cliffs, fight through those defenses, and make absolutely certain that on the morning of D-Day, no shells rain down from that promontory onto American soldiers struggling to gain a foothold in Hitler's Europe. The question is no longer whether to assault Pointe du Hoc. The only question left is who will be asked to do the impossible. April 23, 1944. Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder sits alone in a briefing room at Camp Forest, Tennessee, staring at aerial photographs that show cliffs so steep they might as well be walls. The British commando officer who just finished the briefing has left the room, but his words hang in the air like smoke. With all due respect, Colonel, what you're proposing isn't a military operation. It's organized suicide. Rudder is 34 years old, a former high school football coach and math teacher from Brady, Texas, who joined the Army thinking he might command a training unit stateside. Instead, he's looking at photographs of a fortress in France that he's been ordered to capture with 225 men, scaling cliffs that experts say cannot be climbed under fire. He pours himself another cup of coffee that's gone cold and bitter. And he thinks about his wife Margaret back in Texas, about the baby daughter he's barely met, about the young men under his command who trust him to bring them home alive. Rudder's path to this impossible mission began 3 years earlier, in the autumn of 1941, when a 31-year-old teacher decided that watching the world burn from the safety of Texas wasn't something he could live with anymore. He was old for military service by the standards of that era, married with responsibilities, holding a solid job as a teacher and coach at John Tarleton Agricultural College. He had every reason to stay home, every excuse that society and the Army would have accepted without question. But James Earl Rudder was raised in a family where duty wasn't a word you discussed at dinner parties. It was something you did when it needed doing, whether you wanted to or not. He enlisted as a private, though his education and bearing quickly earned him a commission, and he discovered something about himself that teaching had never revealed. He was good at leading men, particularly young men who needed someone to believe in them before they could believe in themselves. The 2nd Ranger Battalion activated on April 1st, 1943, at Camp Forest, and Rudder took command that June with orders that were typically vague and broadly ambitious. Rangers were a new concept for the American Army, inspired by British commandos, but adapted to American military culture and capabilities. The idea was to create light infantry units capable of rapid deployment, specialized missions, and operations that regular infantry wasn't trained or equipped to handle. What that meant in practice was that Rangers got the missions nobody else wanted, the objectives that looked impossible on paper, and frequently proved to be exactly that in execution. Rudder understood this from the beginning. He'd read the reports from Dieppe, where Canadian and British commandos had been slaughtered on the beaches of France in a raid that accomplished nothing except teaching painful lessons about what not to do. He knew that Rangers were being trained to do difficult things, and that difficult things in wartime usually meant dangerous things, and dangerous things meant body bags. Training the 2nd Ranger Battalion became Rudder's obsession through the summer and fall of 1943. He drove his men through 20-mile forced marches in full combat gear, pushed them through swamps and over obstacle courses designed by sadists, taught them to move silently through darkness and fight hand-to-hand with knives and fists. He wasn't trying to make them hard for the sake of hardness, though plenty of his men cursed his name during midnight marches through Tennessee mud. He was trying to prepare them for something he couldn't yet describe, a mission he didn't yet know about, but could sense approaching like a storm on the horizon. Rangers, he told them repeatedly, lead the way. It would become the unofficial motto of the battalion, later the official motto of all Army Rangers. But in 1943, it was just something their commander said when explaining why they had to run another 5 miles when other units were sleeping. In January 1944, the battalion shipped out to England, and that's when Rudder learned what all the training had been preparing them for. The briefings came in stages, each one revealing a new layer of the mission that awaited them in France. First, they learned about the Atlantic Wall and the gun positions that threatened the invasion. Then they learned about Pointe du Hoc, specifically, saw the reconnaissance photographs that showed the cliffs and the fortifications. Then, in a briefing that Rudder would later describe as one of the most sobering moments of his military career, they learned about the proposed method of assault: ropes, ladders, and a dash across open beach under fire from defenders who would be shooting down at them like hunters in a tree stand. The British commandos who conducted much of the training were professional and courteous, but Rudder could read the skepticism in their eyes. These Brits had tried amphibious assaults against prepared positions, had lost hundreds of men at Dieppe, learning that courage and determination couldn't overcome concrete and machine guns. They thought the Americans were brave but naive, and they expected most of Rudder's Rangers to die on the cliffs of Normandy. But Rudder had an advantage that the British didn't appreciate, something that came from his background as a teacher rather than a career soldier. He understood how to break impossible problems into solvable components, how to take something overwhelming and reduce it to steps that men could comprehend and execute. The cliffs were 100 feet high, but 100 feet was just 30 meters, and 30 meters was just 6 rope lengths of 5 meters each. The gun positions were fortified, but fortified positions had sight lines and blind spots, approaches that were covered and approaches that might offer concealment. The German defenders were professional soldiers, but professional soldiers operated on training and routine. And routines could be disrupted by speed and violence and doing things they didn't expect. In dozens of briefings through March and April, Rudder walked his company commanders through the mission step by step, making them visualize every phase from landing to climbing to fighting at the top. He made them do it so many times that the mission became real in their minds before they ever left England, a mental map that would guide them when the actual assault turned into chaos. The training intensified through April and May, moving from England to Scotland to the Isle of Wight, each location offering different terrain and different challenges. Rangers practiced cliff scaling on the White Cliffs of Dover, fired thousands of rounds learning to shoot while climbing ropes, rehearsed the landing sequence until they could do it blindfolded. Rudder trained alongside them, insisting that he wouldn't ask men to do anything he couldn't do himself, climbing the practice cliffs with his command staff until his hands were raw and bleeding. Some of his officers questioned whether the battalion commanders should be in the first wave, whether Rudder should risk himself when his death might doom the entire mission. He refused to discuss it. Rangers lead the way, he told them, and that meant the commander led from the front. The men noticed this, noticed that their colonel climbed the same ropes they climbed, ate the same rations, slept on the same cold ground. It built a bond of trust that would prove crucial when the real cliffs appeared, and men had to decide whether to follow their commander or surrender to the voice of fear telling them to stay in the boat. By late May, the plan had crystallized into operational orders, typed on paper with attached maps and photographs and timing sequences calculated down to the minute. The 2nd Ranger Battalion would land at Pointe du Hoc at H hour, 6:30 in the morning, on whatever day the invasion commenced, designated as D-Day. Companies D, E, and F, a total of 225 men, would make the initial assault, while the rest of the battalion and the 5th Ranger Battalion, designated Force C, would land at Omaha Beach if the initial assault succeeded, or would divert to Omaha if it failed. Success or failure would be communicated by signal flares fired from the clifftop, a simple system that assumed everything would go according to plan. The mission objective was equally simple in its statement and monumentally difficult in its execution: neutralize the guns at Pointe du Hoc, establish a roadblock on the coastal highway behind the position, and hold until relieved by forces advancing from Omaha Beach. Expected time to relief, approximately 12 hours. Expected casualties, classified, but the British estimates that Rudder had seen in private briefings ran as high as 70%. The night before embarkation, Rudder walked through the camp where his Rangers were cleaning weapons and writing letters home, trying to sleep before the most important morning of their lives. He stopped to talk with small groups, answered questions, made jokes that weren't particularly funny, but earned laughs anyway because the men needed to laugh. Mostly he just listened, letting them talk about home and girls and what they'd do after the war. Normal conversation that kept fear at bay for a few more hours. One young private, barely 19 years old, asked him straight out, "Sir, are we really going to make it up those cliffs?" Rudder looked at the kid, saw the fear and the determination fighting for control of his face, and gave him the only answer that mattered. "Son, I'm going up first, and you're going to follow me, and we're going to do this because it needs doing, and because we're the men who can do it. The cliffs don't know we're coming. The Germans think we can't climb them, and by the time they figure out we're there, we'll be at the top, and then they're going to have a very bad morning." The private nodded, seemed to stand a little straighter, and Rudder moved on to the next group, repeating variations of that same conversation a dozen times before the night was over. June 5th arrived with gray skies and rough seas, and the invasion was delayed 24 hours because weather forecasters predicted impossible conditions for the Channel crossing. Rudder spent that extra day checking equipment one more time, reviewing the plan with his officers until they could recite it in their sleep, trying not to think about everything that could go wrong. That night, lying in his bunk, listening to rain hammer the roof of the Quonset hut, he thought about his wife, Margaret, and his daughter, thought about the men sleeping in barracks around him who trusted him to get this right, thought about the guns at Pointe du Hoc that might or might not be there but would definitely kill a lot of Americans if they weren't silenced. He didn't sleep much, and when he did, he dreamed of cliffs rising into fog and the sound of machine guns echoing off stone walls. Morning came early, as it always does before battles. And James Earl Rudder rose in darkness to lead his rangers toward a cliff that experts said couldn't be climbed, and a mission that everyone agreed couldn't be done. He'd become the man who couldn't say no to an impossible task, and in a few hours, he'd discover whether that made him a hero or just another name on a casualty list. March 14th, 1944. In a rain-soaked field outside London, a British special operations engineer named Captain John Grierson watches a rope spiral through gray morning air and fall 30 feet short of its target, landing in a muddy coil that represents another failed test. The rocket that was supposed to propel the rope to the top of a 4-story building lies smoking on the ground, its charge expended, its payload delivered nowhere useful. This is the 23rd test firing this week, and Grierson is running out of time, running out of ideas, and running out of patience with physics that refuses to cooperate with military necessity. Somewhere in France, American Rangers are training to climb cliffs using technology that doesn't work reliably enough to bet 200 lives on it. The problem seems simple: fire a rocket, trail a rope, establish a climbing line. But simplicity in concept has proven to be complexity in execution. And with D-Day approaching, failure isn't just disappointing, it's potentially catastrophic. The challenge of vertical assault has occupied military minds since ancient times, from siege ladders at city walls to scaling hooks thrown at castle ramparts. But Pointe du Hoc presents a problem that no medieval siege engineer ever faced: cliffs that rise 100 feet straight from a beach swept by machine gun fire, with no opportunity to position siege towers or construct ramps. The Rangers would be climbing from boats in rough seas, under fire from above, with no second chances if their equipment failed. Traditional climbing techniques using pitons and carabiners and experienced mountaineers would be impossibly slow and vulnerable. What the mission required was a way to get multiple ropes to the clifftop simultaneously, quickly, under combat conditions, using men who were trained soldiers rather than skilled climbers. The solution, in theory, involved repurposing British anti-submarine rocket technology to shoot ropes skyward. In practice, it involved months of frustrating trial and error that would have been comical if lives didn't depend on the outcome. The rockets themselves came from the British Admiralty, adapted from weapons designed to throw depth charges at German U-boats. The basic principle was sound. A solid fuel rocket motor generates thrust. That thrust propels a projectile. That projectile trails whatever you attach to it. Engineers calculated that a rocket carrying a 3/4-inch manila rope with a grappling hook attached could reach 100 feet of altitude with enough energy left over to lodge the hook on a cliff top. The calculations were elegant, the diagrams were convincing, and the first test firing sent a rope approximately 40 feet into the air before the rocket tumbled, the rope tangled, and the whole assembly crashed back to Earth in a smoking mess. It turned out that manila rope, even relatively thin manila rope, didn't behave like depth charges. It had mass and weight, but it also had flexibility and a tendency to coil in flight, creating drag that stole energy from the rocket and sent it off course. The breakthrough came in early April, during a test firing that went catastrophically wrong in exactly the right way. A rope that had been left outside overnight in typical English rain was loaded onto a rocket for what engineers thought would be another failure. Instead, the water-soaked rope, heavier and stiffer than dry manila, flew straight and true, trailing behind the rocket like a banner, reaching the target height with energy to spare. The engineer who noticed what happened was named Lieutenant Roberts. And he later said that his first thought was how incredibly stupid they had all been, not to realize that adding weight to the rope would stabilize its flight. Within days, they'd developed a system for thoroughly soaking every rope before loading it onto rockets, storing them in water until the moment of use, accepting the weight penalty in exchange for dramatically improved accuracy. The solution was inelegant, unsophisticated, and absolutely effective, which made it perfect for military application. But rockets and ropes were only part of the equation. The Rangers also needed a way to get backup ladders to the clifftop if the rockets failed, which meant modifying amphibious trucks called DUKWs to carry extension ladders borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. The DUKW, pronounced duck, was one of the minor miracles of wartime engineering, a six-wheeled truck that could operate on land or water, powered by a GMC engine that pushed it through surf and up beaches. Mounting a 100-foot extension ladder on a DUKW required welding steel reinforcement brackets, installing hydraulic systems to raise and extend the ladder sections, and praying that the whole contraption wouldn't tip over when the ladder went vertical. British naval engineers worked through March and April, converting 3 DUKWs into mobile siege towers, knowing that each one represented a backup plan for when the primary assault method failed. The testing moved to the Isle of Wight in May, where cliffs similar to those at Pointe du Hoc offered realistic training grounds for the assault force. Rangers practiced day after day, climbing wet ropes while instructors fired weapons over their heads, simulating the chaos and terror of combat. The rockets worked better now, but better still meant a failure rate around 20%, which translated to 1 in 5 ropes not reaching the clifftop or not anchoring properly when they did. Officers calculated that they needed to fire at least 30 rockets to ensure 15 successful climbing lines, building in redundancy that assumed nothing would work perfectly. The DUKWs proved equally problematic. Their ladders extended properly in calm water, but wobbled dangerously in anything resembling actual sea conditions. Worse, the vehicles had to beach themselves and stabilize before deploying ladders, making them stationary targets for German gunners who would have plenty of time to aim. The training grew increasingly realistic as D-Day approached, with British commandos playing the role of German defenders and using live ammunition to concentrate the minds of the climbing Rangers. Men learned to climb while small arms fire cracked past their heads, learned to keep moving even when the man above them fell, learned the hard mathematics of vertical assault where gravity and enemy action combined to make every foot of altitude a victory. They practiced with wet ropes and dry ropes, smooth ropes and knotted ropes, rope ladders and tubular steel ladders. The variety wasn't about offering choices. It was about ensuring that when one method failed, as something inevitably would fail, there would be alternatives. Rudder insisted on this redundancy, building it into every aspect of the plan, accepting that equipment failure was a certainty rather than a possibility. The final equipment loadout for Pointe du Hoc represented a compromise between what engineers thought would work and what Rangers could actually carry and deploy under fire. Each of the 6 landing craft would carry multiple rocket assemblies, spare ropes, grappling hooks, toggle ropes for hand-to-hand passing up the cliff face, and tubular steel ladders as last-ditch alternatives. The 3 DUKWs would beach separately, each carrying its 100-foot extension ladder and a crew trained to operate the hydraulics under fire. In total, the assault force would have approximately 40 different methods of reaching the clifftop, assuming everything worked as designed, which no one really expected. The entire technical system represented a masterpiece of over-engineering driven by the certainty that combat conditions would degrade performance below design specifications. By the end of May, the equipment worked well enough to proceed, which was not the same as saying it worked well enough to guarantee success. Rockets reached the clifftop about 70 to 80% of the time in testing, but testing didn't include rough seas, combat conditions, or the possibility that German defenders might cut ropes as fast as Rangers could fire them upward. The DUKWs could deploy their ladders in calm water, but calm water in the English Channel on any given day was a pleasant fiction. The ropes themselves, soaked to provide flight stability, would be heavy and difficult to climb, even for men in peak physical condition, and combat would exhaust men before they ever touched a rope. Every technical solution created new problems, and every problem had to be solved with more equipment, more training, more hope that when the moment arrived, physics and courage would combine into something approaching success. On June 5th, when the invasion was delayed by weather, technicians went through every piece of equipment one more time, checking rocket charges and rope integrity and DUKW engines. They waterproofed electrical systems and greased mechanical parts and went through pre-flight checklists that would have made sense for aircraft, but seemed bizarre for climbing equipment. The Rangers cleaned their weapons and sharpened their knives and tried not to think too hard about all the ways that ropes and rockets could fail at the worst possible moment. The engineering that would get them up the cliffs represented the cutting edge of military technology, adapted from submarine warfare and firefighting and civilian climbing techniques. It was brilliant and improvised and barely tested and completely necessary. And in less than 24 hours, it would either prove that human ingenuity could overcome any obstacle, or it would demonstrate, once again, that warfare punishes innovation as often as it rewards it. February 9th, 1944. Flight Lieutenant Thomas McKenna pushes his Spitfire into a shallow dive over the Norman coast, feeling the airframe shudder as flak bursts bracket his position in angry black clouds. His mission is simple in concept and nearly suicidal in execution. Photograph Pointe du Hoc from 500 feet while German gunners use his aircraft for target practice. At this altitude, the limestone cliffs fill his canopy, close enough that he can see individual German soldiers running toward anti-aircraft positions. His gun camera is rolling, capturing images at 4 frames per second, each frame potentially containing information that will save or cost Allied lives. The flak intensifies, and McKenna pulls hard right, feeling G-forces press him into his seat as metal fragments ping off his wings. He's been flying these reconnaissance missions for 3 months now, and he knows the mathematics of survival. Every mission increases the odds that flak or fighters will find him, but the photographs are crucial, irreplaceable, worth the risk. He levels out over the channel and sets course for England, not knowing if he captured anything useful, or if today's mission was just another roll of film for analysts to study in their endless quest to understand a fortress that keeps revealing new secrets. The reconnaissance photographs of Pointe du Hoc represent one of the most intensive intelligence-gathering efforts of the war, a sustained campaign to document every aspect of a single target over 6 months. From January through June 1944, RAF and USAAF reconnaissance aircraft flew more than 60 missions over the promontory, using a variety of aircraft types and camera systems to capture different perspectives. High-altitude runs provided vertical imagery, perfect for mapping positions and measuring distances. Low-altitude runs, like McKenna's, provided oblique photographs that showed details invisible from above. Some missions flew in clear weather for maximum detail, others in marginal conditions when German defenses might be less alert. Each mission added to a growing archive of images that intelligence analysts studied with magnifying glasses and stereoscopic viewers, trying to divine German intentions from shadows and concrete and the patterns of human movement. At RAF Medmenham, 40 miles west of London, a specialized unit of photo interpretation experts spent their days examining these reconnaissance images in a former country estate that had been converted into Britain's Central Photographic Intelligence headquarters. The work was painstaking and often frustrating. Hours spent comparing sequential photographs to detect changes, measuring shadows to calculate heights and depths, analyzing patterns of vehicle movement to estimate garrison strength. Or for Pointe du Hoc, the analysts had developed thick folders containing hundreds of images, annotated maps, and detailed reports describing every aspect of the defenses. They knew the exact dimensions of the gun emplacements, having measured them repeatedly from different angles. They knew the locations of every visible machine gun nest and mortar position. They knew where German soldiers tended to stand during shift changes and where vehicles parked during the day. What they didn't know, with any certainty, was whether the guns were still operational or if the entire position was an elaborate deception. The bombing campaign complicated everything. Starting in April, Allied heavy bombers began hitting Pointe du Hoc with increasing intensity, part of a broader effort to degrade Atlantic Wall defenses before the invasion. On April 14th, B-24 Liberators dropped nearly 300 tons of bombs on the position, followed by more raids on April 22nd and May 7th. By early June, The area had absorbed 698 tons of high explosive, more concentrated firepower than many German cities received during the entire war. The post-strike reconnaissance photographs showed devastation. Overlapping craters that had torn the clifftop into a moonscape, collapsed bunkers, shattered concrete. But they also showed something troubling. In photographs taken days after the heaviest raids, analysts detected signs of continuing activity, fresh earth that suggested tunneling or reconstruction, camouflage netting in new positions, what might be decoy emplacements constructed from wood and canvas. The most sophisticated intelligence tool available to the analysts was stereoscopic photography, which allowed them to view pairs of images taken from slightly different angles and perceive depth and three-dimensional structure. Using devices that looked like oversized viewmasters, analysts could see inside German positions, could distinguish between real concrete and painted canvas, could detect subtle differences in shadow and texture that revealed whether structures were occupied or abandoned. For Pointe du Hoc, stereoscopic analysis revealed that the Germans had built an elaborate system of false positions, designed to draw Allied fire away from actual defenses. Some of the gun emplacements that appeared solid in vertical photographs turned out to be facades, clever constructions that looked real from above but had no actual depth. Other positions that appeared damaged were revealed to be intact but camouflaged with debris and netting. The Germans were playing a shell game with concrete and canvas, and the Allied analysts were trying to follow the hidden ball. By late May, the photographic evidence began pointing toward a disturbing conclusion. The guns might not be at Pointe du Hoc anymore. Analysts comparing images from April and May noticed that certain positions that had shown the characteristic shadows of large-caliber artillery pieces no longer displayed those shadows. Fresh tracks visible in cratered ground suggested vehicles had moved through the area, possibly relocating heavy equipment. Most tellingly, German activity patterns had changed. In March, photographs had captured crews servicing what appeared to be artillery pieces, visible at certain times of day, when long shadows revealed human figures clustered around gun positions. By late May, those activity patterns had shifted to different areas, suggesting the focus of German attention had moved elsewhere. The analysis wasn't conclusive, couldn't be conclusive given the limitations of photography and the skill of German camouflage efforts. But it raised questions that no one wanted to answer. What if the Rangers assaulted Pointe du Hoc and found nothing there? The intelligence dilemma facing Allied commanders in early June was acute and unresolvable. The photographs showed that something had changed at Pointe du Hoc, but they couldn't show exactly what or why. The guns might be gone, relocated to inland positions after the bombing damaged their original emplacements. Or the guns might still be there, hidden under camouflage so sophisticated that even stereoscopic analysis couldn't penetrate it. Or the entire position might be a trap, with the real artillery positioned elsewhere and Pointe du Hoc serving as a decoy to draw Allied attention and resources away from actual threats. Each possibility argued for a different response. Assault the position if the guns were there, skip it if they weren't, reconsider the entire operation if it was a trap. But D-Day was approaching, forces were already embarking, and the time for reconsideration had passed. On June 4th, a final reconnaissance mission brought back the last photographs that analysts would see before the invasion. The images showed Pointe du Hoc shrouded in early morning mist, the clifftop barely visible through layers of haze and smoke from grass fires burning in nearby fields. What little detail the photographs captured suggested no major changes from the previous week. Craters still dominated the landscape, camouflage netting still covered most structures. The position looked simultaneously devastated and operational. An intelligence officer named Major Richards compiled the final assessment report, and his conclusions were models of bureaucratic hedging. Photographic evidence suggests possible relocation of primary armament, but assault forces should assume positions remain operational until proven otherwise. Recommend proceeding with planned assault while maintaining flexibility for contingency operations. It was the kind of report that covered all bases while committing to nothing. Perfect for protecting careers, but less useful for men about to climb cliffs under fire. The Rangers never saw most of these photographs. Rudder received briefings based on the intelligence analysis, saw selected images that showed the layout of the defenses, but the detailed technical assessment and the uncertainty it contained remained classified at higher echelons. This was standard operating procedure. Field commanders received actionable intelligence, not the doubts and qualifications that accompanied it. The institutional logic made sense. You didn't want assault troops questioning whether their objective still existed, but it also meant that Rangers would be climbing those cliffs without fully understanding that the guns they were risking their lives to destroy might not even be there. The intelligence system had done its job brilliantly, collecting and analyzing information with unprecedented thoroughness. But translating that analysis into actionable orders while preserving uncertainty proved impossible. So, the uncertainty was simply discarded in favor of operational clarity. The photographic intelligence archive for Pointe du Hoc would eventually fill multiple filing cabinets at RAF Medmenham and its American counterparts, representing thousands of hours of pilot bravery and analyst expertise. Flight Lieutenant McKenna, who flew that low-altitude mission in February, would fly 7 more missions over Normandy before being shot down in July, surviving to become a prisoner of war. The analysts who measured shadows and counted guns would move on to other targets after D-Day, their contribution to the Pointe du Hoc operation, becoming a footnote in larger organizational histories. But the photographs themselves, preserved in archives on both sides of the Atlantic, remain as testimony to what reconnaissance could and couldn't reveal. They show a fortress in extraordinary detail, document its construction and modification and destruction with scientific precision. What they couldn't show, what no photograph could ever show, was whether the sacrifice required to take that fortress would be justified by what the assault force found at the top. That question would only be answered by men climbing ropes under fire, and by then, the photographs would be irrelevant. September 7th, 1942. Oberleutnant Freiherr Werner von Schöneich stands at the edge of Pointe du Hoc, feeling Atlantic wind cut through his Wehrmacht greatcoat as he watches organization Tod workers pour concrete into wooden forms. He's been transferred here from the Eastern Front, where he spent 18 months learning that modern warfare is primarily about artillery and cover, about who can bring more firepower to bear while protecting their men from the enemy's guns. France represents a vacation posting by comparison, garrison duty defending coastal fortifications against an invasion that might never come. But von Schöneich is a professional soldier, trained at Bad Tolz and blooded at Smolensk, and he approaches this assignment with the same methodical attention to detail that kept him alive in Russia. The promontory offers exceptional fields of fire, commanding approaches from both east and west. With proper fortification and adequate artillery, the position could dominate miles of coastline. He watches workers wrestle steel reinforcement bars into place and calculates angles and ranges in his head, already planning how to turn this windswept cliff into a position that could hold against anything the Allies might throw at it. The transformation of Pointe du Hoc from a scenic overlook to a military strongpoint began in early 1942. Part of Hitler's directive to build an impregnable Atlantic wall stretching from Norway to Spain, the task of construction fell to Organization TOA, a paramilitary engineering group that employed millions of workers across occupied Europe, many of them French civilians conscripted for the work. The Pointe du Hoc project began modestly, machine gun emplacements and observation posts dug into the clifftop, using the natural terrain for protection. But after the British-Canadian raid on Dieppe in August 1942 demonstrated that the Allies were serious about amphibious assaults, German coastal defense plans became more ambitious. Pointe du Hoc would receive not just small arms positions, but heavy artillery, 6 captured French GPF 155mm guns capable of reaching targets 15 miles away. The guns themselves were prizes of war with a bitter history. Built in France during World War I, designated Grande Puissance Filleul after their designer, these artillery pieces had defended France against Germany 25 years earlier. When German forces overran French positions in 1940, they captured hundreds of artillery pieces and millions of rounds of ammunition, all of which were promptly pressed into Wehrmacht service. The 6 guns assigned to Pointe du Hoc came from captured stockpiles at the arsenal at Bourges. transported by rail to the Norman coast and then hauled up the cliffs by teams of horses and tractors. Each gun weighed approximately 11,000 pounds, required a crew of 15 men to operate efficiently, and could fire 4 rounds per minute when properly supplied with ammunition. Positioning them on Pointe du Hoc gave the Germans command of a crucial sector of coast, able to interdict landing beaches east and west of the promontory. The gun emplacements evolved through 1943 from open pits to sophisticated fortified casemates. Initial positions were simple earth and sandbag affairs, providing minimal protection while allowing unrestricted fields of fire. But Allied bombing raids demonstrated that open positions were vulnerable. So German engineers designed massive concrete structures using specifications from Organisation Totes' standardized bunker catalog. The H671 casemate design called for reinforced concrete walls 6 feet thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from 500-kilogram bombs. Each casemate partially enclosed its gun, leaving an open embrasure for firing but protecting crew and ammunition from anything except precision bombing. Construction required thousands of tons of concrete poured into elaborate wooden forms, reinforced with steel bars and allowed to cure under protective tarps. French laborers did most of the physical work under German supervision, earning minimal wages and harboring silent resentment that sometimes found expression in subtle sabotage. A bolt loosened, a measurement slightly off, small acts of resistance that wouldn't be detected until the structures faced combat conditions. By early 1944, Widerstands Nest 75, as the position was officially designated, had grown into one of the most formidable strongpoints on the Atlantic Wall. The 6 main gun positions were supplemented by numerous machine gun nests, mortar pits, and observation posts, all connected by a network of trenches and tunnels that allowed defenders to move under cover. The Germans had strung triple coils of barbed wire around the perimeter and seeded the approaches with mines. Anti-aircraft guns provided defense against low-flying aircraft, while pre-registered artillery coordinates ensured that German guns inland could rain shells on any approaching force. The garrison, approximately 200 men from the 2nd Battalion, 916th Grenadier Regiment, lived in underground barracks equipped with bunks, cooking facilities, and storage for ammunition and supplies. For the soldiers stationed there, life at Pointe du Hoc was routine and comfortable, punctuated by drills and training exercises, but largely free from the terror that characterized combat on the Eastern Front or in Italy. The defenders themselves represented a cross-section of the Wehrmacht in 1944, a mix of Eastern Front veterans like von Schöneich, who had been rotated back to supposedly quiet sectors, young conscripts experiencing their first military posting, and Ost battalion troops, Soviet prisoners of war who had accepted service in the German army rather than face starvation in POW camps. The Eastern Front veterans treated their posting with professional competence, drilling their men and maintaining defenses with the knowledge that comfortable positions don't stay comfortable when the shooting starts. The young conscripts mostly worried about leave schedules and girlfriends back in Germany, treating the war as an inconvenience interrupting normal life. The Ost battalion troops, Georgians and Ukrainians and Russians wearing German uniforms, existed in a precarious middle ground, neither trusted by their German officers nor particularly committed to a cause they had been forced to serve. This mixed force created a garrison that looked imposing on paper but carried subtle fractures that combat would expose. Daily life at Pointe du Hoc through the spring of 1944 followed predictable routines. Morning brought roll call and inspection, followed by maintenance work on the guns and fortifications. Afternoons included training, gunnery drills, infantry tactics, practice with the range-finding equipment that allowed crews to accurately target ships or landing forces. Evenings meant hot meals in the mess bunker, card games, letters home. Officers maintained discipline without excessive harshness, understanding that bored soldiers in garrison needed structure, but also needed enough freedom to maintain morale. Leave schedules rotated men back to Saint-Lô or Caen for breaks from the coastal monotony. The war, in early 1944, seemed distant from Pointe du Hoc, despite its proximity to potential invasion beaches. Men knew intellectually that the Allies would attempt an invasion eventually, but eventually felt abstract, a problem for future soldiers rather than present ones. The Allied bombing campaign changed that comfortable abstraction into immediate reality. The first heavy raid came on April 14th, when American B-24 bombers appeared overhead and proceeded to drop nearly 300 tons of high explosive on positions that had seemed secure hours earlier. The bombing was terrifying and devastating in approximately equal measure. Men who had survived the Eastern Front described it as worse than anything they'd experienced in Russia, a sustained pounding that collapsed bunkers, killed soldiers in their sleep, and transformed the clifftop into a cratered wasteland. The guns themselves, positioned in their heavy casemates, survived largely intact, but the supporting infrastructure took tremendous damage. Communication trenches collapsed, burying men alive. Storage bunkers took direct hits, destroying ammunition stockpiles. The neat military order of Widerstands Nest 75 dissolved into chaos and wreckage in the span of 90 minutes. The decision to relocate the guns came from higher command in late April, after multiple bombing raids had demonstrated that the position was no longer survivable for the artillery pieces. Von Schoeneich argued against the move, pointing out that the guns' value came from their elevated position overlooking the beaches. Moving them inland would reduce their effectiveness and potentially expose them to different threats. But his objections were overruled by division headquarters, which ordered the guns withdrawn approximately 800 yards south of the clifftop. Positioned in an orchard area that offered better concealment and protection from aerial attack. The move took several nights of careful work, using teams of horses and French civilian drivers who were paid extra to work in darkness. The guns were positioned under camouflage netting and carefully registered on their new coordinates, maintaining their ability to fire on the beaches while reducing their vulnerability to bombing. Wooden Quaker guns, telephone poles cut and painted to resemble artillery barrels, were installed in the clifftop emplacements to deceive Allied reconnaissance. By early June, the garrison at Pointe du Hoc existed in an odd state of suspension, battle-damaged but functional, expecting attack but uncertain of timing, defending a position that looked devastated from the air, but retained considerable combat power on the ground. The soldiers cleaned their weapons and manned their positions with professional competence, but many privately wondered if they had been forgotten in the broader strategic picture, if their section of coast would actually face the Allied invasion, or if it would come elsewhere. On June 5th, when orders came down from division headquarters to expect possible invasion within 48 hours, the news was received with a mixture of apprehension and dark humor. One sergeant was heard telling his squad, "The Americans are coming to take our beautiful clifftop paradise. Let's make sure they understand why we call it a fortress." The men laughed, but they also checked their ammunition and positioned extra grenades within easy reach. The Atlantic Wall's crown jewel was about to face its first and only test, and whatever confidence German propaganda proclaimed about the defense's impregnability, the men who would actually defend them understood that modern warfare punished certainty with blood and chaos. June 6th, 1944, 6:30 in the morning. Sergeant Leonard Lomel grips the gunwale of Landing Craft Assault 862 as the vessel pitches violently in 12-foot swells, seawater cascading over the bow and soaking the Rangers huddled inside. He can see the cliffs of Normandy rising through morning haze, but they're the wrong cliffs, too sharp and too close together, nothing like the aerial photographs he's studied for weeks. The British coxswain is screaming something about currents and drift, but his words are lost in the roar of naval gunfire pounding the coast. Lomel looks at his company commander, Captain Ralph Goranson, and sees the same realization in his eyes. They're approaching Pointe de la Percée, 2 miles east of their target, and every second of delay means more Rangers will die when they finally reach the correct cliffs. The mission is already falling apart, and they haven't fired a shot or climbed a single foot. This is how impossible operations begin, with navigation errors and chaos and the sinking certainty that the plan everyone spent months perfecting has just become irrelevant. The navigation error occurred because timing is everything in amphibious warfare, and timing had already failed before the landing craft left the transport ships. The original plan called for Rangers to land at Pointe du Hoc at H hour, 6:30 in the morning, synchronized with the main landings at Utah and Omaha Beaches. But rough seas slowed the run to shore, and strong eastward currents pushed the small landing craft off course faster than the coxswains could compensate. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, in the lead boat, was the first to recognize the error when he saw cliff formations that didn't match his mental map. He ordered the flotilla to turn west, parallel to shore, running through German artillery fire while trying to reach the correct objective. The delay would prove catastrophic. 40 minutes lost to navigation, 40 minutes during which Force C, the reinforcement battalion waiting offshore, would assume the mission had failed and divert to Omaha Beach, leaving the assault force alone and unsupported. The run west toward Pointe du Hoc took the landing craft through a gauntlet of fire that introduced Rangers to the industrial-scale violence of modern warfare. German positions on the cliffs above poured machine gun fire into the boats, tracers creating geometric patterns against gray sky, as rounds skipped off the water and punched through the thin wooden hulls of the landing craft. The Navy destroyer, Satterlee, positioned offshore to provide fire support, hammered German positions with 5-inch guns, each shell creating geysers of earth and concrete as it impacted the clifftop. British rocket ships launched salvos of 5-inch rockets that screamed overhead and detonated in massive explosions designed to suppress defenders. The noise was overwhelming, physically painful, loud enough that men couldn't hear their own officers shouting orders from 5 feet away. Rangers crouched below the gunnels, trying to make themselves small, knowing that steel helmets and wool uniforms offered zero protection against machine gun rounds, traveling at 2,500 feet per second. At 7:09 in the morning, 40 minutes late and under heavy fire, the first landing craft grounded on the rocky beach at the base of Pointe du Hoc. The ramps dropped and Rangers poured out, splashing through waist-deep water toward a narrow strip of beach littered with rocks and debris. German soldiers on the clifftop threw grenades that tumbled down through space and exploded on the beach, sending shrapnel whining through the air. Machine gun fire raked the landing zone, kicking up spray from the water and sparks from the rocks. Sergeant Lomel, one of the first men out of his boat, ran through the surf and threw himself against the base of the cliff, pressing into the limestone as bullets chipped stone inches from his head. The cliff offered protection from direct fire, but not from grenades, which Germans were dropping with methodical regularity, forcing Rangers to keep moving, keep pressing forward, searching for dead ground where they might survive long enough to start climbing. The rocket-fired ropes, the technological solution that was supposed to solve the problem of vertical assault, failed spectacularly in the first minutes of the attack. The rockets worked mechanically, firing with impressive pyrotechnic displays and trailing ropes upward toward the clifftop. But the ropes had been soaked in seawater to add weight and stability, and several hours in the landing craft had made them waterlogged and heavy beyond design specifications. Many rockets climbed 30 or 40 feet before the weight of the rope pulled them back down, the lines falling in tangled coils on the beach. Others reached the clifftop, but lacked sufficient energy to lodge their grappling hooks securely, the hooks sliding back down the cliff face as soon as weight was applied. Of approximately 30 rockets fired in the first 10 minutes, fewer than a half established secure climbing lines. Rangers watching this equipment failure had 2 choices: wait for backup systems to deploy, or start climbing the few ropes that had worked. Most chose to climb. The DUKWs, those amphibious trucks with their 100-foot fire ladders, proved even less successful than the rockets. Of 3 DUKWs launched, only one reached the beach in operational condition. The others swamped in rough seas or took direct hits from German artillery, their crews killed or forced to abandon ship before reaching shore. The single DUKW that made it to the beach managed to extend its ladder partially before German machine gun fire killed the operator and damaged the hydraulic system. The ladder stood at perhaps 60 feet, 40 feet short of the clifftop, offering no practical assistance to the assault. This failure meant that backup climbing systems were unavailable, that every Ranger would reach the clifftop using ropes or wouldn't reach it at all. Technology had failed, redundancy had failed, and the mission now depended entirely on men willing to climb wet ropes while Germans shot at them from above. Private Harry Roberts was among the first Rangers to reach the clifftop, climbing a rope that swayed and twisted as other men below him added their weight. German soldiers appeared at the cliff edge, silhouettes against gray sky, throwing grenades down and shooting at the climbers with rifles and machine pistols. Roberts climbed with his rifle slung across his back, unable to return fire, focused entirely on hand-over-hand progress up a rope that seemed impossibly long. A grenade exploded 15 feet below him, the concussion shaking the rope so violently he almost lost his grip. He kept climbing, arms burning with lactic acid, lungs gasping for air, moving through a private hell where only the next handhold mattered. At the clifftop, he rolled over the edge and into a shell crater, fumbling for his rifle as German soldiers 20 yards away turned toward him. He fired first, working the bolt of his M1903 Springfield rifle with mechanical precision, each shot another second of survival. Other Rangers climbed over the edge, rolling into the crater with him, and suddenly they were a fire team, 5 men with rifles, pushing forward into the devastated landscape of the clifftop. The battlefield that awaited Rangers on top of Pointe du Hoc resembled something from the Great War. A lunar landscape of overlapping bomb craters, some deep enough to hide a truck, connected by fragments of German trenches and littered with shattered concrete and twisted steel. The bombing campaign had created terrain where visibility extended perhaps 50 feet before craters and debris blocked sightlines. Germans and Americans fought from crater to crater, close enough that rifle fire became less effective than grenades and knives. Rangers discovered that their training in the English countryside hadn't prepared them for this kind of fighting, where combat happened at ranges measured in yards rather than hundreds of yards, where you couldn't see the enemy until you were on top of him. But the Germans faced the same conditions, and the Americans had momentum and desperation on their side. They pushed forward, clearing positions with grenades and rifle fire, taking casualties but gaining ground, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant dying under German counterattack. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder established his command post in a captured German bunker approximately 15 minutes after the first Rangers reached the clifftop. The bunker was small, concrete-walled, smelling of cordite and blood, its previous occupants dead or captured. Rudder set up his radio and began receiving reports from his company commanders, trying to piece together a coherent picture of the battle from fragmentary information delivered by exhausted runners. Company D had taken heavy casualties on the beach, but had elements on the clifftop. Company E was split, some men still climbing, others engaged in close quarters fighting near the eastern edge of the position. Company F had lost its commander to a grenade on the beach and was being led by a sergeant who'd taken charge without orders. The reports painted a picture of chaos and success in equal measure. They were on the clifftop, they were engaged with Germans, but the cost was approaching 50 men killed or wounded out of 225 who'd started the mission. And then came the report that changed everything. A runner from Company E arrived at the command post, blood streaming from a head wound, delivering a message that Rudder initially refused to believe. "Sir, the guns aren't here. The casemates are empty. We've checked all 6 positions. The guns are gone." Rudder stared at the man, processing information that invalidated the entire mission objective. They'd climbed those cliffs, lost dozens of men, fought their way onto this devastated promontory, all to destroy guns that weren't there. The strategic calculus that justified the assault had just collapsed into bitter irony. But Rudder was enough of a soldier to understand that missions evolve and objectives change. They'd taken Pointe du Hoc, whether the guns were there or not, and the position still commanded the coastal highway and overlooked the invasion beaches. He ordered his companies to establish a defensive perimeter and sent patrols inland to search for the missing artillery. The assault phase of the mission had succeeded, barely, at terrible cost. Now came the hard part, holding what they'd taken until relief arrived. The 40 minutes of hell getting up the cliffs would prove to be just the beginning. 7:25 in the morning, Sergeant Leonard Lomel rolls into a bomb crater and comes face to face with a German soldier less than 15 feet away. Both men react with the instinct of training, rifles coming up, fingers finding triggers, the universe contracting to a simple equation of who shoots faster. Lomel fires first. his M1903 Springfield barking once, the German soldier spinning and falling as the .30-06 round punches through his chest. There's no time to process what just happened, no moment for reflection or regret, because another German appears at the crater's edge and Lommel is working his rifle's bolt action, chambering another round, firing again. This is combat stripped to its most primitive elements. See the enemy, kill the enemy, survive until the next enemy appears. The entire clifftop has become a maze of craters and trenches where Rangers and Germans stumble into each other at ranges where marksmanship matters less than speed and pure violent will. This isn't warfare as imagined in planning rooms or described in field manuals. This is a knife fight on broken ground, and only the fastest and luckiest will see the sunrise tomorrow. The German defenders, recovering from their initial shock at seeing Americans climbing cliffs that were supposed to be unscalable, fell back to their secondary defensive positions with disciplined efficiency. These were Wehrmacht regulars, many of them Eastern Front veterans who understood that initial setbacks didn't determine battle outcomes. They retreated through their tunnel system, a network of underground passages connecting bunkers and fighting positions, emerging behind the advancing Rangers to create interlocking fields of fire. Machine gun teams set up MG-42 weapons in crater positions, using the same bomb damage that hindered German visibility to create prepared positions with excellent cover. The Germans understood their terrain intimately, knew which craters connected to tunnels, which trenches led to dead ends. They used this knowledge to conduct a fighting withdrawal that made every crater a potential ambush site, every trench a killing ground. Rangers adapted to this close-quarters nightmare with tactics that were part training and part improvisation. Thermite grenades, designed to destroy equipment by burning at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, proved effective for clearing bunkers where enemy soldiers had taken cover. Rangers would cook off a grenade for 2 seconds before throwing it through a bunker aperture, the device exploding inside and filling enclosed spaces with white-hot chemical fire that made survival impossible. Smoke grenades created concealment for movement across open ground, though the same smoke that protected Rangers also concealed Germans maneuvering for better firing positions. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives designed for clearing wire obstacles, were repurposed to blast through heavy doors on German bunkers. The Rangers' training in England had included improvisation scenarios, but no scenario could truly prepare men for the fluid chaos of combat where every decision was made under fire and every mistake was potentially fatal. The tunnel system proved to be the Germans' most effective defensive asset and the Rangers' most frustrating problem. German soldiers would disappear into a bunker entrance and emerge 50 yards away, attacking American positions from unexpected angles. Rangers clearing a trench would turn a corner and find Germans who had infiltrated through underground passages, leading to desperate close-quarters battles fought with knives and pistols and bare hands. Private First Class Carl Anderson later described discovering a tunnel entrance and throwing grenades down into darkness, hearing screams and explosions echoing back up through stone corridors he couldn't see. The tunnels created a three-dimensional battlefield where control of surface terrain didn't guarantee security, where Americans had to guard not just flanks and rear, but also underground approaches they couldn't properly defend. Eventually, Rangers began sealing tunnel entrances with explosives or rubble, accepting that this might trap wounded Germans underground, but calculating that security outweighed humanitarian concerns. Medics worked under conditions that defied their training and equipment. Private Eugene Elder, a medic with Company E, spent the first hour of the battle moving from crater to crater, treating wounded men while German fire snapped overhead. He ran out of morphine syrettes within 30 minutes, ran out of sulfa powder shortly after, eventually reduced to using German medical supplies scavenged from captured bunkers. The wounded couldn't be evacuated. The beach below remained under intermittent German fire, and no boats would risk approaching until the situation stabilized. Elder and other medics dragged wounded Rangers into the deepest craters, creating impromptu aid stations that offered some protection from small arms fire, though none from mortars or grenades. Men with sucking chest wounds and shattered limbs lay in muddy shell holes while medics tried to keep them alive with inadequate supplies and sheer determination. Some Rangers died waiting for treatment that never came. Others survived through combinations of luck, constitution, and Elder's desperate competence. The command structure fractured as officers became casualties or lost communication with their units. Captain Ralph Goranson, commanding Company D, took shrapnel wounds to both legs, but continued directing his men from a shell crater that served as a forward command post. Lieutenant Theodore Laprez, leading Company E, was killed by machine gun fire during an assault on a German bunker, command passing to a sergeant who'd never led more than a squad before this morning. Company F's commander, Captain Otto Masny, was severely wounded on the beach, leaving his executive officer to assume command during the climb. This breakdown meant that lieutenants and sergeants were making company-level tactical decisions, that privates were operating independently when their squad leaders fell, that the carefully organized assault force was dissolving into ad hoc groups of men, following whoever seemed to know what they were doing. By 7:45, approximately 20 minutes after the first Rangers reached the clifftop, the immediate German resistance began to crumble, not because the defenders had been defeated in any decisive engagement, but because casualties and confusion had degraded their ability to coordinate defense. Small groups of German soldiers continued fighting from isolated positions, but the unified defensive system had broken down into pockets of resistance that Rangers could reduce methodically. The Americans had paid terribly for this advantage. Estimates later calculated approximately 75 casualties during the climb and initial clifftop fighting, meaning 1 in 3 Rangers was dead, wounded, or missing. But they had achieved their immediate objective of securing the clifftop and breaking through the defensive crust. What remained was the grim work of clearing the entire position and determining what, if anything, they had accomplished by climbing those cliffs. Rudder's command bunker received a steady stream of reports that created a confused picture of success mixed with disturbing revelations. Yes, the Rangers had taken the clifftop. Yes, German resistance was collapsing into isolated pockets. But the gun emplacements were empty, every single one, containing nothing but wooden poles positioned to look like artillery barrels from aerial reconnaissance. The realization spread through the assault force in stages. First disbelief, then anger, then a kind of bitter determination. They had been sent to destroy guns that weren't there, had lost friends and brothers climbing cliffs to reach objectives that didn't exist. The strategic rationale for the mission had evaporated, but the mission itself continued because there was nothing else to do except finish what they'd started. Rangers began the methodical clearing of every bunker and fighting position, collecting German prisoners, treating German wounded alongside American casualties, performing the tedious post-combat work that defines victory once the shooting slows. Around 8:30, Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn volunteered to patrol inland, searching for the missing guns. This was beyond their orders, technically an independent action taken without direct command authorization. But Rangers were trained to show initiative, and both men understood that finding those guns mattered more than staying within the boundaries of their assigned sector. They moved carefully through hedgerows and orchards south of the clifftop position, past dead Germans and destroyed equipment, following a concealed farm road that showed signs of heavy vehicle traffic. Neither man knew that this patrol would become one of the most consequential small unit actions of D-Day, that what they were about to discover would vindicate the entire costly assault. They were just 2 sergeants looking for missing artillery, moving through enemy territory with rifles ready and senses hyper-alert, because that's what Rangers did when someone needed to find something important. The clifftop knife fight had ended, more or less, but the mission at Pointe du Hoc was about to reveal its true purpose in ways that no one, not even Rudder, had fully anticipated. 8:45 in the morning. Sergeant Leonard Lommel freezes mid-step on a dirt farm road 800 yards south of Pointe du Hoc, holding up his fist to signal Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn to stop. Through a gap in the hedgerow, Lommel can see what they've been searching for: 5 massive artillery pieces positioned under camouflage netting in an orchard, arranged in a neat row with ammunition stacked nearby like cordwood. The guns point northwest toward Utah Beach, pre-positioned for firing missions they will never complete. Lommel counts the German soldiers visible around the position, roughly 20 men, most of them sitting in a circle eating breakfast, their weapons stacked against a tree 75 yards from where 2 American Rangers are standing, with thermite grenades and a death wish. This is the kind of moment that military historians later describe with words like audacious and decisive. But in the actual experience, it's pure terror mixed with the crystal clear understanding that you have approximately 60 seconds to act before the enemy notices you're there. Lommel signals Kuhn to cover him and begins moving toward the guns. The discovery of the empty gun positions on the clifftop had transformed the Pointe du Hoc mission from a tactical assault into an intelligence mystery with potentially catastrophic implications. If the guns weren't in their prepared emplacements, where were they? Had they been moved after the bombing, or had they never been there at all? Were they positioned elsewhere along the coast, still capable of interdicting the invasion beaches, or had they been withdrawn entirely for redeployment to another sector? These questions mattered because the entire strategic rationale for the assault rested on the assumption that 655mm guns represented a threat that justified the cost of taking them out. Empty casemates suggested either a successful deception operation by the Germans or a catastrophic intelligence failure by the Allies. Either way, the Rangers had risked everything for objectives that might not exist, and the immediate question facing field commanders was whether to continue the mission or simply hold what they had taken until relief arrived. Rudder had authorized limited patrols beyond the perimeter, recognizing that the missing guns had to be located or accounted for before anyone could claim mission success. He'd warned his patrol leaders to stay within reasonable distance of the defensive position, to avoid contact with German forces if possible, to return with information rather than attempting independent action. Lommel and Kuhn, veterans of countless training exercises and natural-born rangers who believed that rules were guidelines for normal situations and irrelevant when circumstances demanded initiative, interpreted these orders with creative flexibility. They had moved south along a sunken farm road that showed recent signs of heavy vehicle traffic, following wheel ruts pressed deep into muddy earth. The tracks suggested that something large and heavy had been moved through this area recently, and both sergeants possessed enough tactical intelligence to connect those tracks to missing artillery pieces. The orchard where they discovered the guns represented a textbook example of German defensive planning. The position offered excellent concealment from aerial observation, with mature trees providing natural camouflage augmented by military netting. The guns were positioned to fire through cleared firing lanes cut through the orchard, giving them direct sight lines to the invasion beaches while remaining virtually invisible from above. Ammunition bundles sat within easy reach of each gun, suggesting the position was fully prepared for combat operations. What puzzled Lommel was the absence of immediate security. The guns were unguarded in any meaningful sense, with the crew apparently taking a breakfast break and their weapons stacked away from their fighting positions. This suggested either incredible complacency or possible confusion about whether the invasion had actually commenced. German communications had been disrupted by the preliminary bombardment, and it was possible that this battery hadn't received clear orders about what to do when American forces landed. Lommel moved with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that every footfall might make a noise that betrayed his presence. He carried 2 thermite grenades, which would have to be enough, because there was no time to go back for more. Thermite grenades functioned through a simple but devastating chemical reaction. When activated, they generated temperatures approaching 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt through steel, and certainly hot enough to destroy the delicate machinery of artillery recoil systems and traversing gears. Lommel's plan was equally simple. Place thermite grenades in the crucial mechanical components of each gun, activate them in sequence, and withdraw before the Germans realized what was happening. The plan required him to cross open ground, work on the guns while exposed to observation, and escape before 20 German soldiers with rifles decided to investigate the noise. It was, by any reasonable military calculus, a plan that should result in his death. But reasonable military calculus didn't account for fortune favoring the bold, or for German soldiers being too focused on their breakfast to notice an American sergeant committing sabotage 75 yards away. The first gun's recoil mechanism accepted the thermite grenade easily, and Lommel pulled the pin, feeling the grenade's heat begin to build as the chemical reaction initiated. He moved to the second gun, working quickly now because he had perhaps 90 seconds before the first grenade ignited fully and created noise and smoke that would definitely attract attention. The second grenade went into a traversing gear assembly, a precision mechanism that allowed the gun to rotate on its mounting. He pulled that pin and moved to the third gun, aware that Kuhn was visible at the hedgerow with his rifle ready, covering Lomel's withdrawal, but unable to do much if 20 Germans decided to open fire simultaneously. The third grenade went into another recoil mechanism. He'd now run out of thermite grenades, but not out of targets. 2 more guns remained operational. Lomel improvised, using his rifle butt to smash optical sights and fire control mechanisms, destroying anything that looked important or fragile. The noise was unavoidable, metal striking metal, but it still didn't penetrate the German soldiers' breakfast conversation happening 75 yards away. Behind Lomel, the first thermite grenade achieved full ignition, burning with a brightness that even in morning daylight was impossible to miss. White-hot chemical fire melted through the recoil mechanism, turning precision machine steel into slag, destroying the gun's ability to absorb firing stresses and rendering it useless for anything except scrap metal. The second grenade ignited moments later, producing similar results in the traversing gear. Now, the German soldiers noticed something was wrong. They heard the unusual sound of thermite burning, saw smoke rising from their gun positions, and began moving toward their weapons with the speed of trained soldiers responding to unexpected threats. Lomel ran, sprinting back toward the hedgerow, where Kohn was already providing covering fire, rifle shots cracking out to suppress the Germans and buy seconds for Lomel's escape. They crashed through the hedgerow together, ran down the sunken road at full speed, expecting bullets to find them at any second, but driven by pure adrenaline and the knowledge that they had accomplished something extraordinary. Back at the Ranger command post, Lomel and Kuhn reported their success with characteristic understatement. Found the guns, destroyed at least 3, possibly disabled the others. Germans are probably looking for us. Rudder received this information with visible relief, finally understanding that the mission, despite its catastrophic beginning and its empty clifftop objectives, had achieved its fundamental purpose. The guns were neutralized, unable to fire on Utah Beach or any other target. Whether they destroyed 3 guns or all 5 ultimately mattered less than the certainty that these particular artillery pieces would play no role in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Rudder immediately dispatched additional patrols to confirm Lomel's report and to provide security around the gun position, ensuring that Germans couldn't repair the damaged weapons or move the undamaged ones to alternate firing positions. The intelligence vindication came later, when after-action analysis correlated the gun positions that Lomel found with aerial reconnaissance photographs taken in May. Photo analysts, reviewing their images with the benefit of hindsight, could now see subtle evidence that the guns had been relocated, fresh earth in the orchard area, camouflage netting patterns that suggested large equipment underneath, changes in German activity patterns that indicated work happening away from the clifftop positions. The intelligence had been there, buried in hundreds of photographs and thousands of observed details, but it hadn't been conclusive enough to change operational plans. The analysts had warned that something might have changed at Pointe du Hoc, had noted anomalies and suspicious patterns, but they couldn't say with certainty that the guns had moved. Now, with ground truth confirmation, those earlier suspicions gained retroactive credibility. The intelligence system had worked as well as aerial reconnaissance could work, which meant it had provided clues and indications, but not certainty. Certainty required men like Lomel climbing cliffs and searching orchards, risking everything to verify what photographs could only suggest. The destruction of the guns answered one crucial question, but raised another that wouldn't be fully resolved for years. Where was the 6th gun? Intelligence had consistently reported 655mm artillery pieces at Pointe du Hoc, but Lomel had found only 5 in the orchard position. The missing weapon sparked immediate tactical concern. Was it positioned elsewhere, still capable of firing on the invasion forces? Rudder dispatched additional patrols to search the surrounding area, but they found no evidence of a 6th gun in the immediate vicinity of Pointe du Hoc. German prisoners, when interrogated, provided contradictory information. Some claimed there had always been only 5 guns. Others confirmed 6, but couldn't or wouldn't say where the missing weapon had gone. The mystery of the 6th gun would persist long after D-Day, becoming one of the minor enigmas of the invasion story, eventually resolved through archival research that revealed the weapon had been transferred to Maisie Battery for maintenance weeks before the invasion. But on June 6th, the missing gun remained a tactical wild card, a potential threat that couldn't be confirmed or eliminated. By mid-morning, the primary mission at Pointe du Hoc had been accomplished through a combination of careful planning, desperate improvisation, and the kind of individual initiative that Rangers were specifically trained to demonstrate. The guns that threatened Utah Beach had been destroyed or disabled, the clifftop position was secure, and American forces controlled a critical section of the coastal highway. The cost had been terrible. Estimates suggested that nearly 60 Rangers were casualties by 10 in the morning, with more wounded arriving at the aid stations as patrols encountered German resistance beyond the perimeter. But the strategic objective, the reason that 225 men had been asked to climb impossible cliffs, had been achieved. The guns that weren't there on the clifftop had been found and destroyed in an orchard 800 yards away, neutralized by 2 sergeants with thermite grenades and enough audacity to approach an enemy position in broad daylight. Military historians would later debate whether the entire mission was necessary, whether intelligence should have located the guns before the assault, whether the casualties were justified by the results. But on Pointe du Hoc, in the morning of June 6, 1944, those debates belonged to the future. The Rangers had done what they were sent to do, and now they faced the more difficult task of staying alive long enough for someone to notice they had succeeded. 9:15 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder stands in his captured bunker command post, studying a hand-drawn map that's already outdated, listening to a radio operator repeat the same message for the 5th time. 4CC, this is Rudder. We hold Pointe du Hoc. Require immediate reinforcement. The radio crackles with static and distant voices, but nothing that sounds like acknowledgement or promise of help. Through the bunker entrance, Rudder can see his Rangers digging fighting positions in bomb craters, reinforcing their defensive perimeter with sandbags and German wire, preparing for something they all know is coming. The counterattack will arrive eventually, because that's what professional armies do when they lose ground. They organize and they come back in strength. Rudder does the mathematics in his head. Roughly 135 Rangers still combat effective out of 225 who started the mission. Ammunition running low, no resupply possible, no reinforcements apparently coming. His executive officer, Captain Duke Slater, voices the question everyone is thinking. Sir, we've accomplished the mission. The guns are destroyed. Shouldn't we consider evacuating to the beach and awaiting pickup? Rudder doesn't answer immediately, because the answer isn't simple, and simple answers in combat usually mean you haven't understood the problem. The situation facing Rudder at mid-morning on D-Day represented a command crisis that military academies would study for decades afterward. Having accomplished his primary objective at catastrophic cost, should he withdraw to relative safety or hold an exposed position for uncertain strategic benefit? The original mission plan assumed that Force C, consisting of the 5th Ranger Battalion and elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment, would land at Pointe du Hoc within 2 hours of the initial assault, providing reinforcement and establishing a stronger defensive position. But Force C operated under conditional orders. If signal flares indicating success weren't visible by 7 o'clock, the force would divert to Omaha Beach on the assumption that the Pointe du Hoc assault had failed. The navigation delay and the 40-minute late landing meant that Rangers didn't fire their success flares until after 7:30, by which time Force C had already committed to Omaha. The radio messages Rudder was sending weren't being acknowledged because naval communications were overwhelmed with traffic from the main landing beaches, where thousands of troops were fighting to survive against unexpectedly heavy German resistance. The strategic value of Pointe du Hoc, even with the guns destroyed, became clear when Rudder studied his map and considered the bigger picture beyond his immediate tactical situation. The promontory overlooked Route National 13, the only paved coastal road connecting Utah and Omaha beaches. German reinforcements moving to counterattack either landing zone would have to use this road, making it a crucial choke point in the invasion plan. If Rangers abandoned Pointe du Hoc, German forces could use the position to observe Allied movements and coordinate defense of the highway. If Rangers held the position, they could interdict German reinforcements and maintain observation over a critical sector of the invasion front. The mission objectives had always included holding the position and blocking the coastal road, not just destroying the guns. Those secondary objectives hadn't seemed as important during planning, when everyone assumed the guns were the main threat. Now, with the guns neutralized, those secondary objectives had become the primary rationale for staying. The casualty situation complicated every calculation. Approximately 90 Rangers were killed or wounded, which meant roughly 40% of the assault force was out of action before the real defensive battle began. The wounded couldn't be evacuated. The beach remained under intermittent German fire, and no boats would approach until the tactical situation clarified. Medics had set up an aid station in the largest German bunker, where wounded Rangers lay on German bunks and received treatment with a mixture of American and captured German medical supplies. Some wounds were clearly mortal: sucking chest wounds, massive head trauma, arterial bleeding that even immediate surgery couldn't fix. Other men would survive if they received proper medical care within hours, but would die if care was delayed days. Rudder understood that choosing to hold the position meant accepting that some wounded Rangers would die who might have lived if evacuated immediately. It was the kind of calculus that commanders are trained to make but never become comfortable with, trading definite casualties against uncertain strategic benefits. The ammunition situation was equally grim. Rangers had come ashore with basic combat loads: 120 rounds per rifleman, extra magazines for Thompson submachine guns, a limited number of grenades and demolition charges. The intense fighting during the assault and clifftop battle had consumed roughly half of everyone's ammunition. Captured German weapons and ammunition provided some resupply, but Rangers weren't trained on German weapons, and using enemy ammunition created its own problems: different calibers, different loading mechanisms, uncertainty about reliability. Rudder ordered his men to police the battlefield for German weapons and ammunition, to redistribute captured supplies to positions where they'd be most useful, to conserve American ammunition for situations where reliability mattered more than volume. The calculations suggested they had enough ammunition for perhaps 6 to 8 hours of sustained combat, less if German counterattacks came in strength. At 9:45, Rudder made his decision and explained it to his assembled company commanders in the bunker command post. "Gentlemen, we're staying. We took this position at considerable cost, and abandoning it would make those losses meaningless. We control the high ground overlooking the coastal highway, which makes us valuable to the overall invasion effort, whether we have guns here or not. Force C isn't coming in the immediate future, which means we're on our own until forces from Omaha Beach can break through to us. That might be 12 hours, might be 2 days. We hold this ground, we conserve our ammunition, and we make the Germans pay for every foot if they want it back." Questions? There were no questions because Rudder's officers understood that the decision had been made before the meeting, that this briefing was about explaining the why rather than debating the whether. They returned to their positions and began preparing their men for a siege that none of them had trained for, but all of them understood was coming. The psychological impact of Rudder's decision rippled through the Ranger companies in complex ways. Some men felt relief. Holding defensive positions seemed preferable to attempting a fighting withdrawal down cliffs while under fire. Others felt betrayed. They had accomplished their mission, destroyed the guns, and now they were being asked to defend ground for reasons that seemed abstract compared to the concrete certainty of German counterattacks. The Rangers were trained for assault missions, for hitting hard and withdrawing, not for sustained defensive operations against a numerically superior enemy. But they were also trained to trust their officers, and Rudder had earned that trust through months of shared training, and by being first up those cliffs that morning. If the old man said they needed to hold this ground, then most Rangers were willing to accept that judgment, even if they didn't fully understand the reasoning behind it. The German response developed slowly through mid-morning, giving Rangers time to improve their defensive positions, but also allowing German commanders to organize a coordinated counterattack rather than launching piecemeal assaults. Small probing attacks tested the Ranger perimeter, squad-sized units feeling for weak points and gaps in the defense. These probes revealed both the strength and weakness of the Ranger position. They held excellent terrain with good fields of fire, but their perimeter was too large for the number of defenders available. Gaps existed where single Rangers covered 50 yards of front, where German infiltrators could potentially penetrate if they moved carefully and exploited dead ground. Rudder reluctantly ordered his perimeter contracted, pulling back from some of the outer positions to create a more defensible line. This meant abandoning ground they'd fought for, but it also meant concentrating combat power where it would be most effective. By noon, the situation at Pointe du Hoc had stabilized into an uneasy stalemate. Rangers held the clifftop and the immediate approaches to the coastal highway, while German forces controlled everything beyond a few hundred yards of the position. The Rangers couldn't advance without risking annihilation from the larger German forces surrounding them. The Germans couldn't dislodge the Rangers without accepting casualties from an enemy holding superior terrain. Both sides understood that this equilibrium was temporary, that eventually German reinforcements would arrive in sufficient strength to overwhelm the Ranger position, or Allied forces from Omaha Beach would break through and relieve the siege. The question was which would happen first, and whether the Rangers could survive long enough to find out. Rudder's choice to stay had committed his men to a defensive battle that would test not just their combat skills, but their ability to endure fear, exhaustion, and the grinding stress of being surrounded by enemies who wanted them dead. The easy part of the mission, the climbing and the assault, had ended. Now came the hard part, staying alive when survival depended on factors largely beyond their control. 10:15 in the morning, June 6th, 1944. Major General Raymond Barton stands on the deck of USS Bayfield, watching wave after wave of landing craft approach Utah Beach through his binoculars. And he's waiting for the artillery barrage that intelligence promised would turn this invasion into a slaughter. The shells never come. His 4th Infantry Division is hitting the beach in good order, taking casualties, but nothing like the carnage unfolding simultaneously at Omaha Beach 15 miles east. Barton doesn't know why the expected artillery fire isn't materializing, doesn't know that at this exact moment, 200 miles of ocean away, 5 French guns lie destroyed in a Norman orchard, thanks to 2 sergeants with thermite grenades. He's just grateful that his boys are making it ashore alive, that the landing is proceeding with losses his division can sustain rather than losses that would cripple the entire Utah Beach operation. Military history turns on moments like this. Critical threats that don't materialize because someone, somewhere, did something extraordinary that prevented disaster. Utah Beach is succeeding in part because Pointe du Hoc succeeded, and most of the men wading ashore through the surf will never know how close they came to dying under artillery fire from guns that aren't shooting. The mathematics of artillery and amphibious warfare are brutally simple and utterly unforgiving. 655mm guns, properly positioned and competently crewed, can achieve firing rates of 4 rounds per minute per gun, which translates to 144 shells per hour from a 6-gun battery. Each shell weighs 95 pounds and carries approximately 15 pounds of high explosive, designed to detonate in an airburst pattern that maximizes fragmentation effect across the largest possible area. Landing craft approaching a beach present concentrated targets with no cover and minimal maneuver space, perfect conditions for artillery that can drop shells with reasonable accuracy into areas measured in hundreds of yards rather than precise coordinates. A single gun battery firing for 30 minutes could theoretically deliver more than 70 shells onto a beach landing zone, and each shell could disable or destroy a landing craft carrying 36 men. The strategic calculus was straightforward. Operational artillery at Pointe du Hoc could have turned Utah Beach into a killing ground where American casualties would have exceeded planning estimates by an order of magnitude. Utah Beach, designated as the westernmost American landing zone, carried enormous strategic importance for the invasion's success. The beach was selected specifically to establish a beachhead from which American forces could advance west to capture Cherbourg, the deep water port that Allied logistics planners considered essential for sustaining the invasion. The 4th Infantry Division, landing at Utah, was tasked with linking up with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions that had dropped inland during the night, creating a unified American force that could seal off the Cotentin Peninsula. But Utah Beach sat well within range of the Pointe du Hoc guns, and intelligence estimates suggested that uninterrupted artillery fire could make the landing untenable, forcing either catastrophic casualties or complete mission failure. The entire western flank of the invasion depended on Utah Beach succeeding, and Utah Beach depended on those guns at Pointe du Hoc being silent. The actual landing at Utah Beach proceeded with what veterans later described as almost miraculous smoothness, particularly compared to the horror show developing simultaneously at Omaha. Strong currents pushed the assault waves approximately 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zones, which turned out to be fortunate because the alternate landing areas faced lighter defenses. The 4th Infantry Division came ashore beginning at 6:30 in the morning, the same moment Rangers were supposed to be landing at Pointe du Hoc, and they encountered German resistance that was stubborn but not overwhelming. Casualties in the first hour ran to approximately 197 men, killed, wounded, or missing, which represented less than 1% of the assault force. By 10 in the morning, engineer units were clearing beach obstacles, tanks were rolling inland, and the beachhead was secure enough that follow-on waves could land with reasonable confidence of survival. The success shocked Allied commanders who'd been bracing for much higher losses. The counterfactual analysis of what would have happened if the Pointe du Hoc guns had remained operational has occupied military historians for 80 years, and the conclusions are consistently grim. Artillery officers analyzing the geometry of the beach and the range of the guns calculated that every landing craft approaching Utah Beach would have been within effective range for approximately 8 to 12 minutes during the final approach. The guns could have engaged landing craft while they were still in deep water, where hits would cause catastrophic flooding and rapid sinking. Alternatively, the guns could have waited until craft were grounded on the beach and troops were disembarking, maximizing casualties among dismounted infantry who had no cover. Either way, the consensus among analysts is that operational artillery at Pointe du Hoc would have increased Utah Beach casualties by a factor of 5 to 10, pushing total losses into the range of 2,000 to 4,000 men in the first few hours. Those numbers would have approached or exceeded the casualty rates at Omaha Beach, potentially crippling the 4th Infantry Division's ability to function as a coherent force. The comparison with Omaha Beach provides stark illustration of what artillery can do to an amphibious assault. At Omaha, German defenders possessed working artillery positions, including 88mm guns positioned on the heights overlooking the beach. These guns, combined with machine gun fire from fortified positions and mortars pre-registered on the beach, created a killing zone where American casualties exceeded 2,000 men in the first hours of the invasion. Landing craft were destroyed before reaching shore, troops were pinned down on the beach for hours, and the entire operation came close to failure before sheer courage and determination enabled small groups to fight their way off the beach. If Utah Beach had faced similar artillery fire from Pointe du Hoc, the simultaneous disasters at both American beaches might have forced a complete reconsideration of the invasion plan. The Rangers' success in neutralizing those guns didn't just save individual lives, it potentially saved the entire western flank of Operation Overlord from catastrophic failure. The German artillery doctrine in 1944 emphasized the defensive power of well-positioned guns, and the placement of the Pointe du Hoc battery reflected sophisticated tactical thinking. The guns commanded not just Utah Beach, but also the approaches to Omaha, providing overlapping coverage that could interdict multiple landing zones simultaneously. German fire control procedures included pre-registered coordinates for likely landing areas, meaning gun crews wouldn't need to calculate firing solutions under pressure. They'd simply load and fire at predetermined settings. The ammunition storage at the battery included both high explosive and armor-piercing rounds, allowing flexible response to different target types. German planning documents captured after the war showed that the Pointe du Hoc battery was considered one of the most critical defensive assets on the Norman coast, expected to inflict massive casualties on any invasion force attempting landings in its sector. The decision to move the guns inland after Allied bombing didn't reflect a change in their strategic importance, only a tactical adjustment to preserve combat capability while reducing vulnerability to air attack. The post-war assessment by General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, specifically cited Pointe du Hoc as one of the most crucial actions of D-Day, noting that the guns which would have commanded Utah Beach were neutralized through one of the most remarkable feats of arms in military history. Eisenhower understood, perhaps better than anyone else, how close the invasion had come to disaster. How many variables had to align correctly for success? The Pointe du Hoc operation represented one of those variables, a mission that succeeded against long odds and prevented a disaster that most participants didn't even know they'd narrowly avoided. The Rangers who climbed those cliffs fought for many reasons: duty, training, loyalty to their comrades, trust in their leaders. But the strategic effect of their action extended far beyond their immediate tactical situation. They saved thousands of lives that morning, most of them belonging to soldiers who never knew they had been in danger. By mid-afternoon on June 6th, when Utah Beach was secure and troops were pushing inland, the absence of artillery fire from Pointe du Hoc had become one of the invasion's quiet success stories. Not dramatic like the paratroopers at Sainte-Mère-Église, not inspirational like the destroyers at Omaha Beach, deliberately grounding themselves to provide close-range fire support, but crucial nonetheless. Military operations succeed through combinations of heroic action and technical competence and plain good fortune, and Utah Beach benefited from all three. The heroic action came from Rangers climbing impossible cliffs. The technical competence came from months of planning and training that put those Rangers in position to succeed. The good fortune came in the form of German guns being in an orchard rather than in their prepared positions, vulnerable to destruction by two sergeants who happened to patrol in exactly the right direction at exactly the right time. The battle that saved Utah Beach was fought by 225 men at Pointe du Hoc, but its consequences rippled across the entire western invasion sector, creating conditions that allowed the 4th Infantry Division to establish the beachhead that would eventually lead to Cherbourg, to France, to victory in Europe. The Rangers didn't know they were saving Utah Beach that morning. They were just trying to complete their mission and survive, but history would judge them by the lives they saved rather than the objectives they took, and by that measure, their success was absolute and irreplaceable. 2:15 in the afternoon, June 6th. Private First Class. Harry Roberts crouches in a shell crater that's become his entire world for the past 6 hours, listening to German voices calling to each other in the hedgerows beyond his position. His rifle is a captured German Mauser because he exhausted his ammunition for his Springfield during the morning fighting, and he's down to 3 rounds for the Mauser because German ammunition isn't exactly plentiful in craters occupied by Americans. The Ranger to his left, a kid from Wisconsin whose name Roberts can't remember, took a bullet through the throat an hour ago and bled out while Roberts held pressure on a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The body is still there, 5 feet away, because there's nowhere to move it, and moving means exposing yourself to German snipers who've been shooting at anything that moves since noon. This is what siege warfare looks like at the individual level. Men sitting in holes, waiting to kill or be killed, measuring time not in hours, but in heartbeats between moments of terror. The assault on Pointe du Hoc took 40 minutes. The defense of Pointe du Hoc will take 2 days and cost almost as many lives as the initial attack. The German counterattack began in earnest around 2 in the afternoon, approximately 6 hours after Rangers secured the clifftop. The assault came from multiple directions simultaneously, indicating coordination from German commanders who'd spent the morning organizing a response rather than launching hasty piecemeal attacks. Elements of the 916th Grenadier Regiment, the original garrison that had been scattered during the initial Ranger assault, had regrouped and received reinforcement from the 914th Grenadier Regiment positioned inland. German officers understood that Pointe du Hoc represented a dangerous penetration of their coastal defenses, a position from which Americans could observe German movements and interdict the vital coastal highway. Recapturing the position was a tactical necessity, and German doctrine emphasized immediate counterattacks to restore defensive lines before invaders could consolidate their positions. The Germans came with determination born of training and the knowledge that failure to retake Pointe du Hoc would complicate their entire defensive strategy. The Rangers' defensive perimeter contracted to a roughly circular area, approximately 800 yards in diameter, occupied terrain that was simultaneously advantageous and treacherous. The bomb craters provided excellent cover from direct fire, creating ready-made fighting positions that didn't require digging. But the same craters that protected Rangers also concealed German infiltrators, allowing enemy soldiers to approach within grenade range before being detected. The hedgerows that bordered the position provided cover for German assembly areas and firing positions, making it difficult for Rangers to observe enemy movements or call effective fire from the naval guns offshore. The defensive battle became a series of small, vicious engagements where 5 or 6 Rangers in a crater fought off 10 or 15 Germans trying to overrun their position, where victory meant surviving until the next attack, and defeat meant being overrun and killed. There were no dramatic charge and countercharge actions, no heroic last stands, just grinding attrition warfare where both sides fed men into a meat grinder and hoped the other side ran out first. The ammunition crisis dominated every tactical decision throughout the afternoon and evening of June 6th. Rangers were down to roughly 30% of their original ammunition load, and no resupply was possible. The beach below the cliffs remained under intermittent German fire, preventing boats from landing with supplies. Naval vessels offshore could provide gunfire support, but couldn't deliver ammunition or food or medical supplies. Rangers began using captured German weapons extensively, not because they preferred them, but because German ammunition was more available than American. The Mauser K98 rifle became standard armament for Rangers who'd exhausted their Springfield ammunition. The MG-42 machine gun, that devastating German weapon that fired 1,200 rounds per minute, was positioned in Ranger defensive positions and fed with ammunition scavenged from German dead. Stick grenades, the distinctive German steel hand granate with its wooden handle, replaced American fragmentation grenades in many positions. The Rangers were becoming a hybrid force, American soldiers fighting with German weapons, which created its own problems with training and reliability. The night of June 6th to 7th was characterized by infiltration attacks and close-quarters combat that left Rangers exhausted and increasingly casualties depleted. German soldiers, using darkness for cover, attempted to penetrate the Ranger perimeter and establish positions inside the defensive line from which they could attack American positions from behind. Rangers countered with listening posts pushed forward into no man's land, 2-man positions where soldiers lay motionless in shell craters, listening for sounds of German movement and calling back warnings when infiltrators approached. The fighting was intensely personal and terrifying. Men heard enemy soldiers crawling toward them in darkness, threw grenades at sounds rather than visible targets, fired at muzzle flashes and hoped they hit something. Private Anderson later described shooting a German soldier at a range of perhaps 6 feet, close enough that he could see the man's face in the muzzle flash from his rifle. Another Ranger, whose name was lost in casualty reports, died when Germans overran his crater and killed him with bayonets and knives in silence that prevented nearby Rangers from knowing he was under attack until it was too late to help. The casualty situation deteriorated through the night and into June 7th. The aid station in the German bunker overflowed with wounded, medics performing triage and treating the most serious cases first, while others waited in corridors or outside in shell craters. Morphine ran out completely by midnight, leaving medics with no way to manage pain except telling wounded men to bite on pieces of wood or leather. Sulfa powder, the antibiotic that prevented infection in penetrating wounds, was exhausted by dawn on June 7th, meaning that every subsequent wound carried heightened risk of sepsis and death. Blood plasma, critical for treating shock and blood loss, had never been in sufficient supply and was gone by the evening of June 6th. Medics improvised with German medical supplies, which were similar but not identical to American equipment, using German bandages and German splints and German instruments to perform battlefield medicine under conditions that would have challenged fully equipped surgical units. Some wounded Rangers died, not from their wounds, but from complications that proper medical care could have prevented. Infections that antibiotics would have stopped, shock that plasma would have mitigated, bleeding that surgical intervention could have controlled. The perimeter contracted again on the morning of June 7th, as casualties reduced the number of defenders available to hold the line. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, himself wounded by shrapnel during the night but refusing evacuation, ordered his company commanders to abandon the outer defensive positions and pull back to a tighter perimeter centered on the clifftop bunkers. This meant giving up ground they'd fought for, meant accepting that Germans could move closer to the core position, but it also meant concentrating the remaining combat-effective Rangers where they could support each other and maintain a coherent defensive line. By mid-morning on June 7th, approximately 90 Rangers remained capable of fighting, down from the 135 who'd been combat effective at the end of the initial assault. The mathematics were inexorable. They were losing men faster than Germans were losing the will to attack, and unless relief arrived soon, the siege would end with the Rangers' position being overrun. The second major German assault came on the afternoon of June 7th, a coordinated attack that German commanders clearly intended to be the final push that would retake Pointe du Hoc. The assault came from three directions simultaneously, with German infantry advancing behind supporting fire from mortars and machine guns. The Rangers, down to their last ammunition, fought with desperation born of knowing that this might be the attack that broke their defense. They called for naval gunfire support, and the destroyer offshore responded with salvos of 5-inch shells that landed danger close to Ranger positions. The concussions from the impact stunning both Germans and Americans, but disrupting the German attack's coordination. Rangers in forward craters reported hand-to-hand fighting, bayonets and knives and rifle butts used as clubs when ammunition ran out. One position held by 3 Rangers repelled an assault by at least 15 Germans. The Americans firing captured German weapons until those too ran dry, then throwing empty rifles at attackers before being overrun. 2 of those 3 Rangers died in their crater. The third survived by playing dead under German bodies until the attack moved past his position. By evening on June 7th, the German assault had failed, but the cost to both sides was staggering. Rangers had lost another 25 men killed or wounded, reducing their combat effective strength to approximately 65 men. German losses were higher in absolute numbers, perhaps 100 casualties across 2 days of attacks. But the Germans could replace their losses while the Rangers could not. The siege had reached a critical point. One more major German attack would probably overwhelm the Ranger position through sheer attrition. But the Germans had demonstrated reluctance to accept the casualties required for that final push. Both sides were exhausted, ammunition depleted, and waiting for something to break the stalemate. For the Rangers, that something would be relief from forces advancing from Omaha Beach, if those forces could break through German defensive lines. For the Germans, that something would be the arrival of armored reserves that could provide the combat power necessary to crush the American position. The question was which would arrive first, and whether the Rangers could survive long enough to find out. The 2-day siege had proven that Rangers could hold against infantry attacks, even when outnumbered and undersupplied. What it hadn't proven was how much longer they could continue holding, or what would happen when their ammunition ran out completely and German patience finally exceeded their will to resist. June 8, 1944, 10:30 in the morning. Captain Jonathan Miller, an ordnance officer with the 2nd Infantry Division, walks through the orchard south of Pointe du Hoc, counting the destroyed artillery pieces that Rangers have been guarding since they found them 2 days earlier. He counts carefully, checking each gun, examining the thermite damage that rendered them inoperable, making notes on a clipboard for his after-action report. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 guns accounted for, each one a French GPF 155mm piece showing clear evidence of sabotage or mechanical destruction. Miller walks the orchard twice, checking behind camouflage netting and in covered positions, looking for the 6th gun that every intelligence report promised would be here. He finds ammunition, finds fire control equipment, finds evidence of recent German occupation, but he doesn't find a 6th artillery piece. Miller is methodical and professional, and he knows that when you can't find something that's supposed to be there, you have 3 possibilities. It was never there, it's somewhere else, or you're looking in the wrong place. He needs to determine which possibility applies, because somewhere in the chain of command, someone will ask about the missing gun, and "I don't know" isn't an answer that satisfies generals. The intelligence history of the 6th gun begins in late 1943, when French resistance networks reported that Germans were positioning captured French artillery at various points along the Atlantic Wall. The initial reports mentioned 6 guns at Pointe du Hoc, a number that matched German organizational doctrine for coastal artillery batteries. 6 guns represented a standard battery configuration, allowing for coordinated fire missions and providing redundancy if individual weapons were damaged or destroyed. Allied intelligence officers incorporated this 6-gun assessment into their planning documents, and it became accepted fact through constant repetition. Pointe du Hoc had 6 guns. Rangers needed to destroy 6 guns. Mission success required accounting for 6 guns. The number appeared in briefings, in targeting folders, in operational orders distributed throughout the invasion force. By June 6, 1944, the existence of 6 guns at Pointe du Hoc was institutional knowledge, questioned by no one because everyone agreed it was true. The Rangers who found and destroyed the guns on June 6th didn't stop to conduct careful inventory or write detailed reports while German soldiers ate breakfast 75 yards away. Sergeant Lommel destroyed what he could reach in the time available, then withdrew before being discovered. His verbal report mentioned 5 or 6 guns and focused on the crucial fact that he'd rendered them inoperable, not on the precise count. In the chaos of the following 2 days, with Rangers fighting for survival against repeated German counterattacks, no one had the luxury of returning to the orchard to verify exactly how many guns had been destroyed. The mission objective was accomplished. The guns couldn't fire on Utah Beach. Whether that meant 5 guns or 6 guns seemed like an accounting detail that could be resolved later, after the siege ended and proper investigation became possible. Later arrived on June 8th when relief forces finally reached Pointe du Hoc, and staff officers could begin the administrative work of documenting what had actually happened. The investigation into the missing 6th gun began as routine paperwork and gradually transformed into a minor mystery that would perplex historians for decades. Captain Miller's initial report stated facts without speculation. 5 guns destroyed at the orchard position. No 6th gun located despite thorough search of the area. This report triggered inquiries up the chain of command, because intelligence assessments that proved incorrect required explanation and potentially correction. Were the original intelligence reports wrong? Had there only ever been 5 guns? Or had 1 gun been moved elsewhere before the invasion? And if so, where was it now? And did it represent a continuing threat? The questions multiplied because the answers had implications beyond simple accounting. If Allied intelligence could miscount artillery pieces at a heavily photographed target, what other errors might exist in the intelligence picture? Rangers interviewed in the days after D-Day provided conflicting memories about the gun positions. Some men clearly remembered seeing 6 casemates on the clifftop, which would support the 6-gun intelligence estimate. Others recalled only 5 casemates, suggesting either that one position had never held a gun or that their memory of a chaotic battle environment was incomplete. Several Rangers mentioned seeing what appeared to be decoy positions, telephone poles carved and painted to resemble gun barrels when viewed from aircraft. The possibility emerged that one of the 6 guns identified in aerial reconnaissance had always been a decoy, meaning the original intelligence was wrong from the start. This theory satisfied some analysts, but troubled others who'd reviewed the photographic evidence and remained convinced they'd seen 6 actual artillery pieces at various times during the months of surveillance. The German records, when they became available after the war ended, provided partial answers wrapped in bureaucratic ambiguity. War diaries from the 916th Grenadier Regiment confirmed that 6 guns had been positioned at Pointe du Hoc in early 1944, but later entries from late May mentioned battery maintenance and redeployment of equipment, without specifying exactly what equipment had been moved or where it had gone. German artillery units maintained detailed records under normal circumstances, but the chaotic conditions of late May and early June 1944, with Allied bombing intensifying and invasion appearing imminent, had disrupted routine record-keeping. Documents that should have tracked every artillery piece's location and status were incomplete or missing entirely. The Germans themselves, it appeared, might not have maintained perfect accountability for their weapons in the final weeks before the invasion. The breakthrough came decades later, in 1994, when British researcher Gary Stern began investigating coastal defenses in the Normandy region, using a combination of wartime documents and on-the-ground archaeological investigation. Stern discovered references in German records to Mazy Battery, a fortified position approximately 4 kilometers west of Pointe du Hoc that had received minimal attention from Allied intelligence during the war. Further investigation revealed that 155mm gun from Pointe du Hoc had been transferred to Maisie in late May 1944 for barrel replacement and maintenance. The gun remained at Maisie during the invasion, never returning to Pointe du Hoc because the parent battery was overrun before the maintenance could be completed. The missing sixth gun had been 4 kilometers away the entire time, outside the search radius of the immediate Pointe du Hoc area, in a position that Allied intelligence had largely ignored because it didn't appear to house major armament. The Maisie battery discovery resolved the accounting mystery, but raised new questions about Allied intelligence priorities and resource allocation. If a significant artillery position existed at Maisie, why hadn't it received the same attention as Pointe du Hoc? The answer involved a combination of factors. Maisie's positions were better camouflaged. The battery was positioned slightly inland rather than on the prominent clifftop. And German deception efforts had successfully directed Allied attention toward Pointe du Hoc and away from the supporting positions around it. The intelligence failure wasn't catastrophic. Maisie's guns didn't prevent the invasion from succeeding, but it demonstrated how even intensive reconnaissance could miss significant military assets when defenders employed sophisticated camouflage and deception. The sixth gun mystery became a case study in how military intelligence works. Enormous effort, producing generally accurate but not perfectly complete information, with gaps and uncertainties that field units must navigate during operations. The mystery's resolution also vindicated the Rangers' mission in an unexpected way. If Allied intelligence could miss an entire artillery battery at Maisie, then the decision to assault Pointe du Hoc, despite uncertainty about the gun's exact location, appeared more justified in retrospect. The alternative, skipping the assault based on intelligence suggesting the guns might have moved, would have risked those guns remaining operational and capable of firing on Utah Beach. The Rangers' mission succeeded not just because they destroyed 5 guns in an orchard, but because they climbed those cliffs prepared to find and destroy guns wherever they were. The incomplete intelligence made the mission more dangerous and more costly than it might have been, but it didn't make the mission unnecessary. Sometimes in warfare, you send men to investigate threats that might not exist, because the cost of being wrong about a non-existent threat is survivable, while the cost of being wrong about a real threat is catastrophic. For decades, the missing sixth gun fueled speculation and amateur investigation, conspiracy theories, and accusations of cover-ups. Some researchers suggested that Allied intelligence had known about the gun's relocation, but hadn't informed the Rangers, sacrificing them for some unclear strategic purpose. Others proposed that the gun had never existed, that the entire Pointe du Hoc operation was a diversion to draw German attention away from the main landing beaches. The truth, when finally established through patient archival research, was both more boring and more instructive than any conspiracy theory. Administrative records were incomplete. Maintenance schedules disrupted operational deployments. Intelligence was 90% accurate, but not perfect. And the fog of war obscured information that seems obvious in retrospect. The sixth gun mystery became a reminder that even the most carefully planned and intensively studied operations involve uncertainties that can only be resolved by men on the ground, risking their lives to verify what reconnaissance and intelligence can only suggest. The Rangers who climbed Pointe du Hoc didn't know exactly what they'd find at the top, and that uncertainty was intrinsic to their mission rather than a failure of planning. Sometimes, the only way to know if guns are there is to send someone to look and accept that the looking will cost lives whether the guns exist or not. June 7, 1944, 6:30 in the evening. Hauptmann Klaus Becker, commanding a company from the 914th Grenadier Regiment, studies the American positions through binoculars from a hedgerow 500 yards south of Pointe du Hoc. He's been observing the Rangers for 6 hours, noting their defensive positions, counting visible soldiers, watching for patterns that reveal weakness. Becker is a veteran of the Eastern Front, survived Kursk and the retreat from Ukraine, and he understands siege warfare from the attacker's perspective. The Americans are good soldiers, disciplined and brave, but they're weakening. He can see it in the way they move, slower, more cautious, men conserving energy because exhaustion has become as dangerous as German bullets. His orders are clear: retake Pointe du Hoc before American reinforcements arrive from the landing beaches. Division headquarters has allocated artillery support, mortar units, and approximately 400 infantry for this final assault. Becker calculates odds and casualties and decides that the Americans can be overrun if the attack is conducted properly, with coordination and sufficient violence to overwhelm their remaining defenses. He doesn't want to lose half his company taking a clifftop position, but he will if ordered, because that's what professional soldiers do when their commanders decide that ground matters more than lives. The German High Command's decision to mount a major counterattack on the evening of June 7th reflected a strategic calculation about the importance of Pointe du Hoc to their overall defensive scheme. The position, while not containing operational artillery, still dominated the coastal highway and provided observation over a crucial sector of the invasion front. More importantly, allowing Americans to hold a penetration so deep into the Atlantic Wall, defenses represented a psychological defeat that could encourage further Allied aggression. German military doctrine emphasized immediate counterattacks to restore defensive lines, and Pointe du Hoc represented exactly the kind of position that doctrine demanded be recaptured. The resources allocated to the assault, approximately 400 infantry with artillery support, represented a significant commitment given the chaos and competing demands throughout the entire Normandy sector. That so much combat power could be concentrated against one Ranger battalion demonstrated how seriously German commanders took the threat. The assault preparation included a 15-minute artillery barrage, the first time the Rangers had faced German artillery fire, delivered in coordinated fashion rather than random harassing rounds. The shells came from German 105mm howitzers, positioned several kilometers inland, weapons that had survived Allied counter-battery fire and remained capable of supporting infantry operations. The barrage walked across the Ranger positions systematically, seeking to suppress defensive fire and create casualties before the infantry assault began. Rangers huddled in their shell craters and bunkers, unable to return fire against an enemy they couldn't see, absorbing punishment with no way to strike back. The psychological impact was significant. Men who'd been under fire for 2 days, who'd fought off multiple attacks and survived on minimal food and water, now faced artillery that could reach them anywhere within their perimeter. Private Roberts, still in his crater with a captured German rifle, later described the artillery as worse than the infantry attacks because there was nothing you could do except wait and hope that the next shell landed somewhere else. The German assault jumped off at approximately 6:45, just as light was beginning to fail, a deliberate timing choice that would give attackers the advantage of gathering darkness while still providing enough visibility for coordinated movement. 3 companies attacked simultaneously from 3 directions, one from the south along the coastal road, one from the southwest through the orchards, one from the west through hedgerows that provided cover almost to the Ranger perimeter. The attackers moved in squad-sized units, using fire and movement tactics that reflected professional military training. German machine guns provided suppressive fire, while infantry advanced. Then the infantry provided cover, while machine guns displaced forward. It was textbook small unit tactics executed by experienced soldiers, and it placed enormous pressure on Rangers who were already stretched thin and low on ammunition. The defensive battle became a series of desperate stands where small groups of Rangers held specific craters or bunkers against superior numbers, buying time with their lives for the overall defense to hold. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder, wounded and exhausted but still commanding from his bunker, directed the defense with the assistance of his few remaining officers. He'd lost all 3 company commanders by this point, 1 dead, 2 wounded, and evacuated to the aid station. Platoon sergeants were commanding companies, squad leaders were commanding platoons, and in some cases privates with a few months of service were making tactical decisions that should have been made by officers with years of experience. Rudder called for naval gunfire support, and the destroyer USS Satterlee responded with everything it had, firing 5-inch guns on coordinates that brought shells within 200 yards of Ranger positions. The naval gunfire was danger close by any standard, close enough that concussions from the impacts could be felt in the command bunker, close enough that fragments from the shells wounded several Rangers in forward positions. But it disrupted the German attack at critical moments, breaking up concentrations of infantry and destroying machine gun positions that had been pinning down American defenders. The fighting reached its peak intensity around 7:30, when German infantry penetrated the Ranger perimeter in 2 locations, and close-quarters combat erupted in the crater field that had become the inner defensive line. Rangers fought with everything they had left: rifles, pistols, knives, grenches, rocks, fists. A position held by Sergeant Frank Paragori and 2 privates fought off approximately 20 Germans using a combination of rifle fire and thrown grenades, the defenders expending their last ammunition before the Germans withdrew. Paragori would survive the war and receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that evening, though the citation would describe only part of what happened in that crater. Another position, held by 3 Rangers whose names were lost in casualty reports, fell to the German assault, the defenders killed in hand-to-hand fighting that left German and American dead piled together in a shell hole that had become a grave. The battle was intimate and terrible, warfare at distances where men could see each other's faces, where killing was personal, and survival meant being faster or luckier than the enemy trying to kill you. Around 8 o'clock, as darkness made coordinated operations increasingly difficult, the German artillery barrage resumed, but this time it fell short, landing on German positions as well as American ones. The cause was never determined, possibly an error in fire control calculations, possibly communications breakdown between artillery units and frontline infantry, possibly deliberate German fratricide aimed at breaking off an assault that was costing too many casualties. Whatever the reason, the friendly fire disrupted the German attack's momentum at a critical moment, forcing infantry to take cover and allowing Rangers to regroup and redistribute ammunition from casualties to defenders who were still fighting. The German companies, having lost perhaps 100 men killed and wounded in 90 minutes of close-quarters combat, pulled back to their start positions as darkness made further coordinated assault impossible. They'd come close to breaking through the Ranger perimeter, had actually penetrated it in places, but they hadn't achieved the complete breakthrough that would have allowed them to overrun the position and drive the Rangers back to the cliffs. The aftermath of the assault left both sides bloodied and exhausted, but the Rangers had held. At terrible cost, roughly 25 more casualties added to already staggering losses, but they'd held. German dead lay scattered across the approaches to the Ranger perimeter, evidence of the price attackers paid when assaulting prepared defensive positions, even when defenders were outnumbered and undersupplied. Rangers counted their remaining ammunition and found that many positions were down to single-digit numbers of rounds per man. Food and water were nearly exhausted. Medical supplies were gone entirely, and approximately 65 Rangers remained combat effective out of the 225 who'd started the mission 57 hours earlier. The mathematics suggested that one more major assault would overwhelm them through simple attrition, that they'd fought as long and as hard as humanly possible, but that human limits were not infinite. But the Germans didn't know how weak the Rangers actually were, couldn't know that one more coordinated push might succeed where the previous one had failed. The attackers saw their own casualties, saw how stubbornly the Americans defended every crater and bunker, and concluded that another assault would cost more lives than German commanders were willing to pay. The defensive battle had become a contest of wills where both sides were near breaking, but neither could see the other's desperation. The Rangers held because they had no choice, because withdrawing meant climbing down cliffs under fire or surrendering to an enemy that might not take prisoners. The Germans stopped attacking because the cost appeared to exceed the value of the objective, because taking Pointe du Hoc was desirable, but not essential enough to justify losing another company trying to do it. The final assault had failed, not because the defenders were strong, but because the attackers believed they were stronger than they actually were. Sometimes in warfare, perception matters more than reality, and the Germans perceived that the Rangers could hold indefinitely, when in truth they were perhaps 6 hours from complete collapse. The siege would continue into its 3rd day, but the worst of the fighting was over. What remained was endurance, the grim work of surviving until relief arrived, or until the Rangers' position finally became untenable. The final assault had proven that the Rangers could hold against infantry attacks supported by artillery, but it had also proven that they couldn't hold forever. Somewhere between those two truths lay the outcome of the siege, and no one on Pointe du Hoc that night knew which truth would prevail. June 8, 1944, noon. Captain Walter Block, the battalion surgeon, sits outside the aid station bunker, smoking a cigarette with hands that won't stop shaking, despite his efforts to control them. He's been working for 60 hours straight, performing battlefield medicine in conditions that would have been considered impossible at any properly equipped hospital. The wounded inside the bunker lie on German bunks and on the floor and in the corridors. Anywhere, there's space for a man to lie down while his body tries to heal from trauma that modern medicine can barely address even with full resources. Bloch has just finished amputating a ranger's leg using a German surgical saw and captured morphine, working by flashlight because the bunker's electrical system stopped working yesterday. The amputation went as well as could be expected, which means the young man will probably survive if infection doesn't kill him in the next 72 hours. Bloch takes another drag on his cigarette and does mathematics in his head. 135 casualties out of 225 men. 60% casualty rate, worst percentage he's seen in any unit during his entire medical career. He wonders if the mission was worth it, if destroying some guns and holding some ground justifies losing more than half a battalion. The cigarette doesn't answer, and Bloch doesn't have the luxury of philosophical reflection when there are still wounded men inside who need his attention. The final casualty accounting for the Pointe du Hoc operation would take weeks to compile completely, as wounded rangers were evacuated through various medical channels, and some men initially listed as missing were later confirmed as killed. But by June 8th, when relief forces from the 5th Ranger Battalion finally fought through to the position, the immediate count was brutally clear. 77 Rangers killed during the assault and the subsequent siege, their bodies wrapped in shelter halves or German blankets and laid in a mass grave near the command bunker because there was nowhere else to put them and no time for individual burials. 58 wounded seriously enough to require evacuation, men with penetrating wounds and shattered limbs and head trauma who would spend months in hospitals if they survived the initial golden hour of treatment. The mathematics left 90 Rangers who'd come through the operation physically intact, though intact was a relative term that didn't account for exhaustion, mild wounds, or psychological trauma that would manifest later. The breakdown by company revealed how unevenly the casualties had fallen across the battalion. Company D, which landed on the western end of the beach and faced some of the most intense fire during the climb, suffered 48% casualties, almost exactly half its strength. Company E, landing in the center, took 62% casualties, the highest percentage in the battalion, reflecting the fact that they'd been in the heaviest fighting during both the assault and the defensive battle. Company F, on the eastern landing zone, lost 71% of its men, a devastating toll that essentially destroyed the company as a fighting unit. The headquarters element and attached specialists, including medics and engineers, took 33% casualties, lower than the rifle companies but still catastrophic by any normal standard. The pattern revealed what veterans already knew. In infantry combat, the men at the front pay the highest price, and the Rangers had been at the front continuously for 3 days. Comparing the Pointe du Hoc casualties to other D-Day operations provided context that was simultaneously reassuring and disturbing. The average casualty rate across all D-Day landings ran approximately 7.5%, meaning that out of every 100 men who landed, roughly 7 or 8 became casualties during the first day. Utah Beach, the sector that Pointe du Hoc was meant to protect, saw casualty rates under 1%, an almost miraculous figure given the risks inherent in amphibious assault. Omaha Beach, the bloodiest of the American landing zones, suffered casualty rates approaching 10% in some units, with overall losses exceeding 2,000 men. The Rangers at Pointe du Hoc experienced 60% casualties, roughly 8 times the average D-Day rate, and 6 times the rate at Omaha. By this measure, Pointe du Hoc was the deadliest single engagement of the entire invasion, though its relatively small size meant that absolute numbers were lower than the larger battles at other beaches. The temporal distribution of casualties revealed how the mission's danger evolved over time. Approximately 50% of the casualties occurred during the initial assault and clifftop battle in the first 2 to 3 hours of the operation. The remaining 50% accumulated during the 50-hour siege that followed, spread across dozens of small engagements and continuous exposure to German fire. This pattern differed significantly from typical assault operations, where casualties peaked during the initial attack and then declined as defenders were overcome and positions secured. The Rangers experienced sustained high casualties over an extended period because they were never able to fully secure their position, never achieved a defensive posture where they could rest and recover. The siege was as costly as the assault, which meant that Rangers who survived the initial fighting had to continue fighting at high intensity without reinforcement or resupply, accumulating casualties until relief finally arrived. The medical situation at Pointe du Hoc represented a case study in battlefield medicine under worst-case conditions. The kind of scenario that medical officers train for but hope never to experience. Captain Block and his medics performed surgery in a bunker with no electricity, using instruments sterilized by boiling water over German camp stoves, with anesthesia limited to whatever morphine could be scavenged from American and German supplies. They treated sucking chest wounds and compound fractures and penetrating abdominal injuries, conditions that required immediate surgical intervention by specialists in properly equipped hospitals. Many men survived who should have died, testimony to the skill and determination of medics working under impossible conditions. But some men died who would have survived with proper medical care, victims of infections that antibiotics could have prevented or shock that blood plasma could have mitigated. The medical triage decisions that medics made, choosing which wounded to treat first and which to comfort while they died, were decisions that would haunt those medics for the rest of their lives. The post-war debate about whether the Pointe du Hoc mission was justified given its cost began almost immediately and has continued for 80 years without reaching consensus. Historian Stephen Ambrose, in his book D-Day June 6, 1944, called Pointe du Hoc the most dangerous mission of D-Day, and argued that the Rangers' success was crucial to the invasion's overall success. Other historians have questioned whether the mission was necessary at all, noting that the guns had been moved before the assault and suggesting that better intelligence could have prevented the operation entirely. Military analysts have examined the casualty figures and debated whether 60% losses were acceptable for the strategic benefits achieved, or whether the operation represented a planning failure that sent men to die for objectives that didn't exist. The debates have generated thousands of pages of analysis and counter-analysis, with no clear consensus emerging except that the Rangers accomplished what they were sent to do at extraordinary personal cost. The Rangers themselves, when interviewed decades later, generally avoided second-guessing the mission or dwelling on the casualties. Sergeant Lomel, whose patrol found and destroyed the guns, insisted repeatedly that the operation succeeded in its objective and that success justified the price. Other veterans focused on the comradeship and determination that enabled them to survive, avoiding discussions of whether their sacrifice was strategically necessary. Some Rangers expressed bitterness about the delayed relief and the communication failures that left them isolated for 3 days. But most veterans, when pressed about whether the mission was worth the cost, defaulted to a simple formulation. They were soldiers, they were given a mission, they completed it. The philosophical questions about strategic value and acceptable losses were matters for historians and generals, not for men who'd climbed the cliffs because their country asked them to do so. The institutional lessons learned from Pointe du Hoc shaped Ranger training and doctrine for generations afterward. The operation demonstrated that specialized units could accomplish missions that conventional forces couldn't attempt, validating the entire concept of Ranger battalions. It also demonstrated the importance of realistic training, of ensuring that soldiers practiced under conditions approximating combat before facing actual enemy fire. The equipment failures, particularly the wet ropes and the swamped DUKWs, led to improved testing protocols for specialized gear and greater emphasis on backup systems and contingency planning. The communication failures that left the Rangers isolated led to better coordination procedures and more robust radio systems. Every significant failure at Pointe du Hoc generated a study and a recommendation, and eventually a change in how the Army prepared for similar operations. The Rangers' blood purchased lessons that subsequent soldiers benefited from, a cold calculus that didn't comfort the families of the 77 men who died on that Norman clifftop, but ensured that their deaths contributed to improving how America fights its wars. By the afternoon of June 8th, when the last wounded Rangers were being evacuated and engineers were beginning to improve the defensive positions for the relieving force, the butcher's bill for Pointe du Hoc was complete but not final. Complete in the sense that all casualties had been accounted for and recorded in the grim paperwork that follows combat operations. Not final in the sense that some wounded would die in hospitals days or weeks later, that some psychological wounds would take decades to manifest, that the full cost of the operation would echo through families and communities long after the war ended. The 60% casualty rate would stand as one of the highest for any American unit in World War II, testimony to the mission's difficulties and the Rangers' determination. Whether that sacrifice was justified, whether the guns destroyed and the ground held were worth 135 casualties, remains a question that each person answers according to their own understanding of duty, strategy, and the mathematics of warfare, where lives are spent to achieve objectives that might or might not matter in the larger scheme of victory and defeat. June 8th, 1944, 8:15 in the morning, Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, commanding the 5th Ranger Battalion, leads his advance elements through a hedgerow gap and sees Pointe du Hoc for the first time, a cratered moonscape where his fellow Rangers have been fighting for survival for 56 hours. His battalion was supposed to land here on D-Day as reinforcements, was supposed to arrive within 2 hours of the initial assault to provide fresh troops and supplies. Instead, they've spent 2 days fighting through German positions from Omaha Beach, losing men to snipers and machine gun nests and minefields, advancing by yards when they should have been covering miles. Schneider sees Rangers emerge from shell craters, men who look like they've aged 10 years in 3 days. Gaunt faces and 1,000-yard stares and movements slow with exhaustion. The first Ranger he meets is a sergeant who looks at him with eyes that have seen too much and says, "Where the hell have you been, Colonel? We've been waiting." It's not an accusation, just a statement of fact delivered without emotion, because emotion requires energy these men no longer possess. Schneider has no good answer, because "we came as fast as we could" sounds like an excuse when you're talking to men who've been surrounded and outnumbered for 3 days. The story of Force C, the reinforcement element that was supposed to support the Pointe du Hoc assault, began with a plan that was tactically sound and operationally fragile. The 5th Ranger Battalion and attached infantry units, approximately 500 men total, would follow the initial assault force to Pointe du Hoc if the assault succeeded. Success would be indicated by signal flares fired from the clifftop at specific times, yellow smoke at H plus 15 minutes to indicate Rangers were climbing, red flares at H plus 30 minutes to indicate the clifftop was secured. If those signals weren't observed by 7 o'clock in the morning, Force C would divert to Omaha Beach on the assumption that the Pointe du Hoc assault had failed and that reinforcing a failed operation would compound the disaster rather than salvage it. The plan made sense given the information available during planning, but it had a critical vulnerability. It depended on precise timing and clear visual signals during an amphibious assault where nothing ever went exactly according to schedule. The navigation error that delayed the Pointe du Hoc assault by 40 minutes destroyed the entire signal plan before the first Ranger climbed a rope. When the assault force finally reached the correct cliffs at 7:10 in the morning, 40 minutes late, they fired their success signals in disguise that Force C had already stopped watching. The decision to divert had been made at 7 o'clock, based on the absence of signals that should have appeared by 6:50, but didn't because the Rangers were still approaching the wrong cliff. By the time Rangers were fighting on the clifftop and firing flares to indicate success, Force C was already committed to Omaha Beach, their boats heading east toward what would prove to be the bloodiest fighting of D-Day. The institutional inflexibility that prevented Force C from reconsidering their diversion decision reflected both command limitations and the fog of war. With radio communications disrupted and visual observation limited by distance and smoke, there was no easy way for commanders offshore to know that the Pointe du Hoc assault had actually succeeded despite the delayed signals. Omaha Beach proved to be a nightmare that consumed the 5th Ranger Battalion's attention and combat power for the next 2 days. The battalion landed in the middle of a catastrophe. Troops pinned down on the beach, landing craft destroyed in the surf, casualties mounting with terrifying speed as German defenders poured fire onto an invasion force that couldn't get off the beach. The Rangers did what Rangers do. They found a gap in the defenses, a draw leading up the bluffs, and they assaulted it with the same kind of desperate determination that their fellow Rangers were demonstrating at Pointe du Hoc. The 5th Battalion lost dozens of men in the first hours at Omaha, fought all day June 6th to secure a foothold on the bluffs, then spent June 7th expanding the beachhead and preparing to advance inland. The radio messages from Rudder requesting relief were received but couldn't be acted upon immediately because the 5th Battalion was engaged in its own desperate fight and couldn't disengage to conduct a relief operation until their own situation stabilized. The advance from Omaha Beach to Pointe du Hoc covered approximately 6 miles of Norman countryside that Germans had spent years fortifying and that American forces had to clear hedgerow by hedgerow. The 5th Battalion moved out on the morning of June 8th, fighting through German positions that included machine gun nests, mortar pits, snipers, and minefields. The advance was measured in hundreds of yards per hour rather than miles, each hedgerow a potential ambush site, each sunken road a defensive position that had to be cleared with grenades and rifle fire. The Rangers lost men to mines that had been waiting since 1943 for someone to step on them, lost men to snipers who shot from concealment and disappeared before return fire could find them, lost men to mortars that German forward observers called in with practiced efficiency. The relief of Pointe du Hoc, which planners had envisioned as a relatively simple link-up operation, became a mini-campaign that cost the 5th Battalion approximately 25% casualties over 2 days of fighting. When the first elements of the relief force finally reached Pointe du Hoc at 8:15 on June 8th, the survivors of the 2nd Ranger Battalion were at the end of their physical and psychological endurance. They'd been fighting continuously for 58 hours, had survived on minimal food and water, had fought off multiple German counterattacks while outnumbered and undersupplied. The relief force brought food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies, all of which were desperately needed. More importantly, they brought the psychological relief of knowing that the siege was over, that the Rangers at Pointe du Hoc were no longer isolated. That help had finally arrived. The meeting between the 2 Ranger battalions was emotional and subdued. Men who'd served together in training, who knew each other by name and reputation, reuniting under circumstances where celebration was impossible because too many friends were dead or wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Rudder's first words to Schneider, according to multiple witnesses, were both a greeting and an accusation. "Where the hell have you been?" Rudder was exhausted, wounded, and angry, emotions that he'd suppressed during the siege, but that emerged now that survival was no longer occupying all his mental energy. Schneider explained the diversion to Omaha and the fighting required to reach Pointe du Hoc, but explanations felt inadequate when you were talking to a man who'd held position for 3 days expecting relief that should have arrived 2 days earlier. The conversation was professional and correct, 2 officers discussing operational matters, but beneath the professional courtesy lay the unspoken question that neither man could answer satisfactorily. Should Force C have waited longer before diverting? Should they have sent scouts to verify that the Pointe du Hoc assault had failed before committing to Omaha? Should someone in the chain of command have recognized that the signal plan was too rigid for the chaos of amphibious assault? The post-war investigation into the Force C diversion produced official reports that assigned no blame and emphasized the fog of war and the difficulty of command decisions made with incomplete information. The reports noted that the signal plan, while flawed, was reasonable given the planning assumptions, and that the decision to divert Force C was made in good faith based on the best information available at the time. The investigation concluded that no individual or unit had failed in their duty, that the 40-minute delay was an unfortunate navigation error that triggered cascading failures in the communication and reinforcement plan. The findings satisfied official requirements for accountability, but didn't satisfy the Rangers who'd fought at Pointe du Hoc, many of whom believed until their deaths that better command decisions could have brought relief sooner and saved lives. The institutional answer was that war is chaos and plans rarely survive contact with reality. The human answer was that friends died while help sat offshore or fought battles elsewhere, and rationalization doesn't resurrect the dead. The relief of Pointe du Hoc on June 8th marked the end of the Rangers' isolation, but not the end of the battle. German forces continued to contest the position through sniper fire and occasional probing attacks, and the combined Ranger force maintained defensive positions for another several days until regular infantry units arrived to take over the sector. The 2nd Battalion, or what remained of it, was withdrawn from the line and sent to rear areas for rest and reconstitution. They'd accomplished their mission and held their ground at a cost that made them heroes in official histories and broken men in private. The relief that came too late had still come in time to prevent the position from being overrun, but it came too late to prevent the catastrophic casualties that defined the Pointe du Hoc operation. The signal failure and the navigation delay and the diversion to Omaha represented a chain of small mistakes that combined into a nearly fatal outcome, saved only by the determination of Rangers who refused to quit, even when quitting would have been understandable. Military history would record the relief as arriving within 72 hours of the initial assault, which sounds reasonable in historical summaries, but 72 hours of siege warfare at 60% casualties created wounds that took lifetimes to heal, if they healed at all. October the 3rd, 1947. Major Thomas Hereford, U.S. Army Historical Division, sits in a Paris hotel room surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with German documents captured during the occupation of France. He's looking for a specific war diary, the daily operational log from the 916th Grenadier Regiment that defended Pointe du Hoc, because the American after-action reports don't match the physical evidence at the battlefield. The Americans reported 6 guns destroyed, but post-battle investigation found only 5 guns in the orchard. The Americans reported approximately 200 German defenders, but German casualty figures suggest fewer than 150 men were actually present. The Americans reported that signal flares were fired at 7:30, but observers on 4 sea ships swear they were watching until 8 o'clock and saw nothing. Every battle generates contradictions between what participants believe happened and what evidence suggests actually occurred. And Hereford's job is to reconcile those contradictions into something approaching historical truth. It's detective work applied to warfare, forensics at the scale of battalions and beaches, and it's proving much more difficult than anyone anticipated because the sources keep contradicting each other. The American after-action reports filed in the weeks immediately following D-Day reflected the fog of war and the difficulty of accurate observation under combat conditions. Rangers interviewed about the assault provided estimates rather than precise counts. Approximately 30 rockets fired, maybe 15 climbing ropes reached the top. I think we had 50 or 60 men combat effective by noon. These estimates were reasonable given the circumstances, men providing best recollection of chaotic events while under fire. But they weren't precise enough for historical record. Different Rangers gave different casualty estimates for the same company, reported different times for the same events, remembered the sequence of actions differently. The company commanders who might have provided authoritative accounts were mostly casualties themselves, killed in action or wounded badly enough that they couldn't provide detailed debriefs. The after-action reports compiled from these fragmentary accounts were valuable but incomplete, requiring corroboration from other sources to establish facts. The German records, when they became available after the war, provided an alternative perspective, but created as many questions as they answered. The war diary from the 916th Regiment showed that the unit had moved the guns inland on May 26th, nearly 2 weeks before the invasion, which confirmed Sergeant Lomel's discovery, but contradicted some Allied intelligence assessments. The diary also recorded approximately 180 men assigned to defend Widerstandsnest 75, fewer than the 200 that American intelligence estimated. German casualty reports, filed with typical Wehrmacht bureaucratic precision, listed 47 men killed and 73 wounded during the 3-day battle, significantly fewer than American estimates of German casualties, but still representing roughly 2/3 of the garrison. The discrepancies suggested either that American observers overestimated the size of the defending force or that German records were incomplete, possibly omitting casualties from attached units or Ost battalion troops whose losses weren't always recorded with the same care as ethnic German soldiers. The physical archaeology of the battlefield provided another layer of evidence that sometimes contradicted both American and German written records. French officials conducting post-war clearance of the Pointe du Hoc site found unexploded ordnance and shell fragments that allowed forensic analysis of what weapons had been used where. They found American rifle casings in positions that after-action reports didn't mention being occupied, suggesting that Rangers had held ground that wasn't officially recorded. They found German equipment and personal effects in quantities that suggested the garrison might have been larger than German records indicated, or that German troops from other units had reinforced the position during the battle. Most tellingly, they found evidence of tunnel systems extending beyond the areas shown on captured German engineering diagrams, suggesting that the defensive infrastructure was more extensive than either side fully understood during the battle. The photography evidence, particularly the reconnaissance images taken before and after the invasion, allowed analysts to track changes over time and verify or refute claims made in written records. Pre-invasion photographs clearly showed 6 gun positions at Pointe du Hoc, confirming that the intelligence assessment of 6 guns was correct at some point. Post-invasion photographs showed only 5 destroyed guns in the orchard, supporting the conclusion that 1 gun had been moved elsewhere. Careful comparison of photographs taken in late May with earlier images revealed subtle evidence of the gun relocation: disturbed earth in the orchard area, changes in camouflage patterns, vehicle tracks suggesting heavy equipment had been moved. The photographs provided objective evidence independent of human memory or institutional bias, though they couldn't answer all questions because aerial photography has inherent limitations in what it can reveal. The process of interviewing veterans years and decades after the battle revealed how memory evolves, and how individual experiences can diverge from collective narratives. Sergeant Lomel, interviewed multiple times between 1945 and his death in 2011, told essentially the same story about finding and destroying the guns. But small details changed. The number of thermite grenades varied between accounts. The distance to the German soldiers eating breakfast grew larger in later retellings. The level of danger described intensified as years passed. These changes didn't indicate dishonesty. They reflected how memory works, emphasizing dramatic elements while forgetting mundane details, sharpening contradictions, and smoothing over ambiguities. Other Rangers remembered events differently than Lomel, placed themselves in locations that records suggested they couldn't have been, described actions that may have been memories of training rather than combat. The historian's task was to find the common elements across multiple inconsistent accounts, identifying facts that remain stable while acknowledging that individual memory is inherently unreliable. The discovery of new evidence decades after the battle continued to reshape understanding of what happened at Pointe du Hoc. In 2004, British researcher Gary Stern's investigation of Maisie Battery resolved the mystery of the 6th gun, providing documentation that one weapon had been transferred for maintenance weeks before the invasion. In 2010, French archaeologists using ground-penetrating radar discovered previously unknown tunnel sections beneath Pointe du Hoc, suggesting that the German defensive system was even more sophisticated than wartime observers realized. These discoveries didn't fundamentally change the narrative of the battle, but added nuance and complexity, demonstrating that even intensively studied operations retain secrets that only emerge through patient investigation long after participants are dead. The academic debates about Pointe du Hoc have generated hundreds of scholarly articles and dozens of books, examining everything from tactical decisions to strategic impact to the operation's place in broader D-Day narratives. Historians have argued about whether the mission was necessary, whether casualties were acceptable, whether better intelligence could have prevented the assault or reduced its cost. Military analysts have dissected the equipment failures and communication breakdowns, using Pointe du Hoc as a case study in what can go wrong during complex operations. Some researchers have focused on individual soldiers' experiences, using oral histories to reconstruct the battle from the perspective of men who climbed the cliffs and fought in the craters. Others have taken institutional approaches, examining how military organizations learn from operations like Pointe du Hoc and incorporate those lessons into doctrine and training. The academic consensus, to the extent one exists, holds that Pointe du Hoc was a tactically successful operation with strategic significance executed at higher costs than necessary due to intelligence and planning limitations, demonstrating both the possibilities and the dangers of specialized military operations. The forensics of battle, the patient work of establishing facts from contradictory evidence and incomplete records, serves purposes beyond satisfying historians' curiosity. It provides accountability, ensuring that soldiers' actions are recorded accurately rather than distorted by propaganda or institutional memory. It facilitates learning, allowing military organizations to study what worked and what failed, so that future operations benefit from past experience. It honors the dead by ensuring their sacrifice is remembered correctly, not through myths that inflate or diminish what actually happened. The forensic investigation of Pointe du Hoc has been ongoing for 80 years and will continue as long as people care about understanding warfare with precision rather than accepting convenient narratives. The Rangers who fought there deserve nothing less than the truth. As best as that truth can be reconstructed from fragments and memories, and the stubborn physical evidence of a battlefield that still bears scars from 3 days in June, when impossible missions proved to be merely extremely difficult. Present day. A 12-year-old French boy named Alexandre stands at the edge of a bomb crater on Pointe du Hoc, looking down at limestone scarred by explosions 80 years ago. His school brought him here on a field trip, and the guide has spent an hour explaining what happened on this clifftop in 1944. Americans climbing ropes while Germans shot at them, men fighting in craters like this one, courage and sacrifice and words that don't quite capture the reality of what warfare does to human beings. Alexandra picks up a rock and throws it to the bottom of the crater, counting seconds until it hits, trying to imagine what it felt like to climb a cliff knowing people above were trying to kill you. The rock bounces and settles, and Alexandra can't imagine it, can't really understand what brought soldiers to this clifftop, or why they stayed when they could have left. The guide talks about democracy and tyranny, freedom and fascism, but Alexandra is 12, and those concepts are abstractions. What's real is this crater, this cliff, this place where something important happened, that everyone agrees was important, even if explaining exactly why remains difficult. The guide shepherds the students toward the next stop, and Alexandre takes one last look at the crater before following, carrying with him an image that will remain in his memory long after other details of this trip have faded. The preservation of Pointe du Hoc as a memorial site began in 1945, when French authorities recognized that the battlefield's physical features told a story that words couldn't fully capture. Unlike many D-Day sites that were cleared and rebuilt, Pointe du Hoc was deliberately left as it was, craters unfilled, bunkers intact, the clifftop landscape frozen in time at the moment when combat ended. The American Battle Monuments Commission assumed responsibility for the site in 1979, designating it as the Pointe du Hoc Ranger Monument and implementing preservation measures to prevent erosion and deterioration. The 30 acres of preserved battlefield include the original German fortifications, the shell craters created by Allied bombing, and a simple granite monument honoring the Rangers who fought there. Approximately 400,000 people visit Pointe du Hoc annually, making it the second most visited D-Day site after the American Cemetery at Omaha Beach, testimony to the enduring fascination with the Rangers' achievement. The physical site deteriorates slowly but inevitably because limestone weathers and concrete crumbles, and no preservation effort can permanently freeze a landscape in time. Engineers monitor the cliff face for erosion, noting that the Atlantic storms that made the assault so difficult continue to batter the stone, gradually reducing the cliff's height and stability. The bunkers crack and settle as their foundations shift, requiring periodic stabilization to prevent collapse. The craters, initially deep enough to hide trucks, gradually fill with windblown soil and vegetation, blurring the sharp edges that characterized them in 1944. Preservationists face an impossible task, maintaining a battlefield landscape when natural processes constantly work to heal the scars that make the battlefield historically significant. Every year that passes makes Pointe du Hoc slightly less accurate as a representation of what Rangers saw in June 1944, and every preservation effort represents a compromise between historical fidelity and practical necessity. The educational programs at Pointe du Hoc attempt to bridge the gap between preserved landscape and lived experience, using interpretation to help visitors understand what happened here. Rangers who survived the battle occasionally returned for anniversary commemorations, standing in the craters where they fought and trying to explain to younger generations what it meant to climb those cliffs. These veteran testimonies, recorded on video before the last Rangers died, provide first-hand perspective that no historical analysis can replicate. They describe not just what happened, but how it felt: the fear during the climb, the chaos of the clifftop fighting, the exhaustion of the siege, the relief when it ended. The testimonies are uncomfortable viewing because they're honest about warfare's ugliness, describing not heroes performing noble deeds, but frightened young men doing extremely dangerous things because they'd been trained to do them and couldn't imagine letting their comrades down. The military academy lectures on Pointe du Hoc examine the operation as a case study in mission planning, execution, and leadership under extreme conditions. West Point includes Pointe du Hoc in its curriculum on small unit tactics, using the battle to illustrate how junior leaders adapt to changing circumstances when plans collapse and communication breaks down. The Ranger School at Fort Benning uses Pointe du Hoc as an example of what Rangers should aspire to achieve, the kind of impossible mission that defines the Ranger identity. NATO military academies teach Pointe du Hoc to international officer students, examining how Allied cooperation worked at the tactical level and how specialized units fill niches that conventional forces cannot. The academic analysis tends to emphasize successful improvisation and leadership, treating Pointe du Hoc as a triumph of courage over adversity. The veterans' accounts emphasize confusion and fear and the randomness of who lived and who died, treating Pointe du Hoc as survival rather than triumph. Both perspectives are true, which makes the operation difficult to understand comprehensively. The question of whether modern military forces would approve a mission like Pointe du Hoc generates spirited debate among defense professionals and historians. Contemporary military culture emphasizes force protection and acceptable risk, using technology and firepower to reduce casualties rather than relying on individual courage to overcome disadvantageous situations. The 60% casualty rate at Pointe du Hoc would be considered unacceptable by modern standards, suggesting either that the mission was planned incorrectly or that commanders accepted losses that contemporary military ethics would reject. But the counter-argument holds that some objectives require accepting high risks, that special operations forces today still conduct missions where casualty rates might approach Pointe du Hoc levels if things go wrong. The debate usually concludes that Pointe du Hoc represented a specific moment when specific circumstances required a type of courage that modern militaries hope to avoid needing, but must remain capable of demonstrating. Whether that conclusion is wisdom or rationalization depends largely on whether you're analyzing the mission from the comfort of a university office or from the perspective of someone who might be asked to climb similar cliffs in future wars. The cultural legacy of Pointe du Hoc extends beyond military history into broader narratives about American identity and values. President Ronald Reagan's 1984 speech at Pointe du Hoc on the 40th anniversary of D-Day used the Rangers' achievement as a metaphor for American courage and democratic values, declaring, "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc," in a passage that became one of the most quoted presidential speeches of that era. The Rangers' story appears in films and documentaries and books, often simplified into narratives of heroism that allayed the confusion and mistakes and sheer luck that enabled success. Popular culture tends to treat Pointe du Hoc as unambiguous triumph, Rangers overcoming impossible odds through determination and skill. Academic history treats it as more ambiguous, a successful mission with avoidable flaws, achieved through courage but at costs that better planning might have reduced. The tension between popular narrative and scholarly analysis reflects broader questions about how societies remember warfare, whether we should emphasize inspiration or caution, celebration or critique. The last surviving Ranger from the Pointe du Hoc assault, as of 2025, represents a living connection to events that are rapidly passing from memory into history. The The transition from living memory to historical record changes how events are understood and discussed, removing the authority of first-hand testimony and increasing reliance on documents and physical evidence. When the last veteran dies, Pointe du Hoc will belong entirely to historians and archaeologists and filmmakers, interpreted through methods that can reconstruct what happened, but cannot fully capture what it meant to the people who experienced it. This transition is inevitable and necessary, but it also represents a loss. The voices of men who climb those cliffs will be replaced by voices of people who study those who climb those cliffs. A subtle but significant shift in how the story is told and understood. The clifftop at Pointe du Hoc, viewed from the same spot where Alexandre stood during his school field trip, reveals landscapes both natural and human-made. Limestone cliffs shaped by millions of years of geological processes. Bomb craters created in seconds of violence. The Atlantic horizon, where invasion fleets gathered 80 years ago. The view connects past and present, makes history tangible in ways that documents and photographs cannot achieve. Standing there, you can understand viscerally what the Rangers faced. The height of the cliffs, the exposure of the clifftop, the vulnerability of men climbing through space where gravity and enemy fire conspired to kill them. You can also understand the limitations of such understanding, recognizing that visiting a peaceful battlefield doesn't replicate the experience of fighting on it, that no amount of historical imagination can truly reconstruct what warfare does to human consciousness. Pointe du Hoc preserves the stage but not the performance, the setting but not the terror and courage and chaos that define the battle. What remains is enough to inspire, to educate, to remind. Whether it's enough to prevent future wars from creating future Pointe du Hocs is a question that each generation must answer through their choices about when courage justifies casualties, and when wisdom requires finding alternatives to battles that test the absolute limits of human endurance. The final understanding of Pointe du Hoc belongs neither to historians who analyze it nor to visitors who tour it, but to the men who fought there and carried its memories for the rest of their lives. Their understanding was fragmentary and personal, memories of specific moments rather than comprehensive narratives, emotional truths about fear and friendship rather than strategic assessments of necessity and cost. When the last veteran dies, that personal understanding dies with him, and what remains is the version of Pointe du Hoc that can be reconstructed from evidence and testimony. That reconstructed version will be more complete than any individual memory, drawing on multiple perspectives and archival sources to create a comprehensive account. But it will also be less true in important ways, missing the immediacy and authenticity that only direct experience provides. The point that changed everything, the clifftop where 225 Rangers proved that impossible missions are merely extremely difficult, will persist as memorial and metaphor and case study. But the lived reality of June 6 through 8, 1944, belongs to the past and to the men who survived it, gradually fading as they fade, until only the stone and the craters and the questions remain.